The first night I started at the Lighthouse, I thought it was going to be quiet. I had applied for a temporary night shift position, filling in for the usual keeper who had taken a leave of absence. The pay was good, the solitude sounded appealing, and I liked the idea of living in a lighthouse perched on the jagged cliffs of Maine with the Atlantic crashing below. I was a little naive, though, in thinking the night would be peaceful. From the moment I arrived, the place had a strange, unsettling energy that I didn't fully understand. The lighthouse itself was old, built in the 1800s. It had been modernized in some ways, electric lights, a small kitchen, and an updated generator, but the structure retained that oppressive sense of history. The walls were thick, and the stairs leading up to the lamp were steep and creaked under every step. The smell of salt, damp wood, and rust was pervasive. At first, I chalked it up to age and proximity to the sea, but later I started thinking it wasn't just the sea that made the air feel heavy. I arrived in the late afternoon, and the caretaker, an older man named Frank, gave me the rundown. He was a quiet guy, almost too quiet, and he avoided eye contact when he spoke. "Nothing much happens here," he said, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. "Just keep the light running, check the machinery, log everything. That's it. Nights are long, but they're quiet." He handed me a thick logbook, a set of keys, and a flashlight that had seen better days. I settled into the small keeper's quarters. The room was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a table, and a chair. The window overlooked the ocean, and I watched the waves crashing against the rocks as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first night was uneventful, just me, the lighthouse, and the constant sound of the ocean. I checked the light, made sure the generator was running, and sat down to read. Around midnight, I started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, like the scraping of something heavy across the wooden floor above me. I thought maybe it was just the wind, or the old building settling. But then I heard a low, dragging sound, deliberate, slow, moving along the upper floor. My first instinct was to think someone had snuck in, but the doors were all locked, and the windows too high and narrow to climb through. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously climbed the stairs to the second floor. Nothing. Just the empty, cold hallway. The dragging sound had stopped. I checked every door, every closet, every nook. I even went up into the tower itself. The lamp was fine, the machinery humming softly. The light swept across the ocean, bright and unbroken. I went back down, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. By the time I returned to my quarters, the noise hadn't returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next night, things escalated. Around 2 a.m., I was writing in the logbook when I heard a voice, clear, soft, almost a whisper, coming from the room above. It said my name, Ethan. My heart froze. I told myself it was the wind or my imagination, but the voice came again, a little louder this time. "Ethan, come upstairs." I didn't move for a long time. My hand gripped the logbook so hard my knuckles turned white. Finally, curiosity, or maybe foolishness, pushed me forward. I took the stairs slowly, listening. There was nothing in the hallway, just the shadows stretching across the peeling wallpaper. The whispering stopped. Then I saw it. At the top of the stairs, in the corner of the hallway, a figure stood. Not fully formed, more like a shadow, but it had a human shape. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt its presence like a weight pressing against my chest. I froze, unable to move or speak. After what felt like minutes, it vanished. Just like that, gone. I ran back to my room and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By the third night, I was exhausted, but I didn't want to admit to anyone what was happening. Frank had told me nothing much happens here, and I figured he'd think I was losing it. But the noises kept coming. The whispering voices, the dragging, the feeling of eyes on me no matter where I went. One night I swore I saw footprints in the dust on the wooden floor that weren't mine, leading from the tower down to the kitchen. I followed them, and they ended at the wall. No doors, no windows, just solid brick. I tried to rationalize it. The isolation, the lack of sleep, the sound of the ocean, it could all play tricks on the mind. But then came the things that couldn't be explained. The light in the tower would flicker even though the generator was running fine. I would hear the bell chime at odd hours, even though it was electric and controlled by a timer. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. A chair would be in a different place. A tool I left on the counter would be on the floor, but I never saw anyone. One night around 3 a.m., I heard the dragging again. It was louder this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and went up the stairs, and the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath fogged in the beam of light, and then I heard it, a low moan like someone in pain. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just the moan growing louder, echoing off the walls. I stepped into the corner where I'd seen the shadow before. The light flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness. My flashlight had died. I fumbled to get the spare, and in that brief moment, I felt it. Cold fingers brushed my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing. Heart pounding, I turned on the flashlight and shone it everywhere. Nothing. But when I looked back at the corner, the shadow was there again, more distinct this time. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure, hunched, staring at me with hollow black eyes. I stumbled back, tripping over the steps, and fell against the railing. The figure moved, gliding silently across the floor, and I swear it smiled. A thin, cruel smile. I ran down the stairs, out of the tower, and slammed the door to my room, locking it. I stayed there until dawn, rocking back and forth, listening to the silence that returned once the first light of morning crept across the ocean. The days that followed were a blur. I stopped trying to sleep at night. I ate less, drank more coffee than I probably should have, and avoided the tower as much as possible. The shadows didn't stop, though. Every night I would hear dragging, whispers, and sometimes the sound of footsteps pacing just outside my door. Once I swore I saw someone or something looking in the window while I was brushing my teeth. A face, pale and elongated, staring with empty eyes. When I blinked, it was gone. Frank noticed I was on edge, but he didn't ask questions. When I tried to talk to him about it, he just nodded slowly and said, "You'll get used to it. Everyone does. Or you'll leave." I wanted to leave. I thought about quitting every day, but there was a contract, and I needed the money. Plus, a small, stubborn part of me wanted to understand what was happening. One night, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the whisper again. This time, it was insistent, desperate. "Ethan, help me." It was coming from the storage closet. I froze. Something in my gut told me not to open it, but the voice was pleading, almost human. I opened the door slowly. The closet was empty. I slammed it shut, my hands shaking, and backed into the wall. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next week was a nightmare. The sightings became more frequent. Shadows would appear in the corners of my eyes, vanishing when I turned to look. The dragging sound moved closer and closer to my room. And then the lamp, the lighthouse lamp itself, started acting strangely. It would spin erratically, sometimes sweeping the cliffs and the ocean in a disorienting rhythm. Once, it turned on and off without anyone touching it. The light seemed angry, almost aware. One particularly bad night, I heard a scream. Not a whisper, a full-throated scream that echoed off the walls and down the stairs. It was a woman's voice, terrified and raw. I ran toward it, following the sound to the tower. The stairs were slippery with condensation, my flashlight flickering. When I reached the top, the lamp was swinging violently, as if something had thrown it. I tried to steady it, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw them. A dozen figures, all staring at me from outside the tower. Pale, featureless, eyes hollow. They raised their hands, reaching toward me. I backed away, tripping, and fell down the stairs. Pain shot through my leg, but I scrambled to the bottom. The figures weren't outside anymore. They were in the hallways, silent, watching. I ran to my room, locked the door, and sat there, shivering until sunrise. By the time Frank returned from his days off, I was barely holding it together. He looked at me and said nothing at first, just handed me a cup of coffee. Then he finally spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the closet." "What closet?" I asked, confused. "The one in the kitchen. There's nothing there, but some things are better left alone." I didn't understand. Better left alone? What the hell is going on here? He shrugged. "I've been here a long time. You get used to the shadows, the voices, the things that move when you're not looking. Some people don't." He paused. "They leave. Some don't make it." I left that night. I quit and drove away before Frank could say more. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memories. The dragging, the whispers, the pale figures, the eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. I tell people it was stress, isolation, maybe the wind in my imagination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was a place that watched, that waited, that hungered, and I was only the latest to realize it. Sometimes, when I'm driving along the coast at night, I see a faint light spinning in the distance. My stomach tightens. I know it's the lighthouse, still standing, still waiting for the next keeper, the next victim, and I know that if I ever went back, whatever I saw would be waiting for me. I never talk about it. No one believes me. But the memory never fades. I can still hear the whispers in the dead of night, echoing off the cliffs, calling my name. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the shadowy figures, reaching, smiling, always watching. I thought leaving would end it. But some nights, I wake up drenched in sweat, and I swear I can hear the lighthouse bell ringing in the distance, long after I should have been asleep, long after I should have been safe. And I know, somewhere, it's still waiting. Waiting for the next night, the next keeper, the next soul foolish enough to think they could handle the night shift at the lighthouse. Story. The end. I arrived at Seabright Lighthouse just as the sun was setting over the Atlantic. The winter chill in Massachusetts was biting, and the wind cut through the thick jacket I wore. I had applied for the off-season night shift after seeing the ad in a local job board. Pay was good, housing included, and I figured it would be a quiet gig for a couple of months. The lighthouse itself stood on a craggy point outside the town, accessible by a narrow, winding road that twisted through woods and over rocks before opening onto the small cliff. It was a tall, white tower, paint peeling in patches, with a single cottage next to it for the keeper. My relief, a grizzled man named Carl gave me a brief tour. "Nothing fancy," he said, leading me through the control room, the generator room, and the stairwell up to the lantern room. "You run the light, log anything unusual, and keep the radio on schedule. No one likes nights here, especially when the fog rolls in. You'll learn why soon enough." His tone made my stomach tighten, but I smiled and nodded, eager to start. The first few nights were quiet. The fog hadn't fully set in yet, and the waves slapped against the rocks with a predictable rhythm. I spent my nights checking the light, cleaning lenses, and occasionally stepping outside to watch the storm-tossed sea. There was a wild serenity in it, almost hypnotic. The isolation, I thought, was a blessing. Then came the first night of the fog. It crept in around midnight, thick and clinging, reducing the world outside the lighthouse to a white nothingness. I could barely see the railing around the observation deck. That's when I first heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible knocking. Slow, deliberate taps coming from the base of the tower. My heart skipped a beat, and I forced myself to call out. "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it down. Nothing but swirling fog and slick rocks. I convinced myself it was the wind, perhaps a branch tapping the lighthouse, and tried to calm down. I stayed by the lantern room all night, double-checking the light and listening to the wind whip past. Over the next week, the occurrences became more pronounced. Sometimes I would wake to the sound of footsteps pacing on the deck outside, even though I knew I had locked the doors. I started hearing faint whispers on the radio, garbled and broken, sometimes seeming to repeat my name. When I tried to speak into the microphone, the static would grow worse, and then the voices would stop, leaving an oppressive silence that made the air feel heavier. One night, around 2 a.m., I was checking the machinery when I heard crying. Not the wind, not gulls. It was the unmistakable sound of a child weeping. I froze, trying to tell myself it was a dream or my imagination, but the sound continued, soft but desperate, coming from outside the lighthouse walls. I grabbed my flashlight and ran down the spiral staircase to the ground floor, shoving open the door. The fog pressed in on me, thick as soup. The sound had stopped, but on the wet rocks below I saw footprints, small, bare, leading toward the edge of the cliff and stopping abruptly. I leaned over to see more, and then caught movement in the corner of my eye. A small figure, indistinct and pale, was standing just beyond the fog, motionless, staring at me. I blinked, and it was gone. Shaken, I spent the remainder of the night inside, keeping the light running at all costs. When I called the Coast Guard in the morning to report the strange occurrences, they listened politely and said there were no ships near the point and no scheduled patrols. A week later, during a storm, the generator failed. The light went dark for less than a minute, but in that time I heard screaming. It was all around me. Men, women, children, drowning, gasping, calling for help. I pounded on the generator, praying for it to restart. The moment the light flickered back on, the screaming stopped, replaced by the hollow roar of the storm. The next morning, I found scratches on the door and the wet footprints again, this time leading right up to the cottage and stopping at the threshold. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something had been watching me every night, lingering just at the edge of perception, waiting for the light to falter. I lasted through the winter, but it was grueling. Nights stretched endlessly, punctuated by whispers, footsteps, and glimpses of figures in the fog. Each time the generator sputtered or the light flickered, I felt my chest tighten, convinced the drowned were just beyond the walls, waiting for me to fail. When my relief arrived in early March, I was a wreck, sleep-deprived, pale, and jumpy. Carl gave me a hard look, one that spoke volumes. "You made it through," he said. "Most don't last more than a few weeks after the fog sets in." I left Seabright Lighthouse that day, vowing never to return. Even now, years later, I dream of the fog rolling in, of the child's weeping just beyond the door, of the moment the light faltered and the ocean itself seemed alive with voices. Sometimes, driving along the coast at night, I can see the beam of Seabright sweeping across the dark water, and I swear I can hear whispers on the wind calling my name, waiting for the light to falter again. Story the end. The lighthouse stood on a craggy spit of land off the coast of Massachusetts, a solitary figure against the Atlantic waves. I'd taken the nightkeeper job because I needed the kind of isolation that city life could never give me. After years of working in offices with fluorescent lights and ringing phones, the idea of sitting alone, watching the horizon, and listening to the wind and the waves sounded like peace. I arrived in late October, when the nights were long and the storms frequent. The ferry from the mainland carried me and my supplies: food, a stack of logbooks, cleaning supplies, and the tools for routine maintenance. The captain, an older man named Lewis, gave me a thin smile. "The lighthouse is an honest job," he said, "but it can get personal." I didn't know what he meant at the time. The lighthouse itself was 3 stories of weathered stone, topped with a glass lantern that housed the main light. There was a spiral staircase inside that creaked with every step, and a series of small rooms where previous keepers had lived. The smell of salt, rust, and old oil was pervasive. The first nights were quiet. I climbed the stairs each hour to check the light, logged the weather, and monitored the radio. On the third night, I noticed something strange, a shadow moving along the outer catwalk. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the wind making the lantern's reflection dance. But when I squinted through the fogged glass, I saw a figure, a man, I think, standing still, staring out to sea. I ran to the door, but it was locked from the inside. When I looked again, the figure had vanished. My heart raced, and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bird, maybe the trick of fog and light. That night, I slept fitfully, waking to the sound of knocking, slow, deliberate knocks coming from the bottom of the staircase. I sat upright in bed, listening. After a few moments, silence returned. Over the next week, the incidents increased. Whispers echoed from the walls, sometimes barely audible, sometimes loud enough to make me flinch. Doors that were closed would be found open. Small objects, tools, logbooks would appear in places I hadn't left them. One night, a storm rolled in. Wind battered the tower, waves pounded the rock foundation, and the lighthouse shuddered. I climbed to the lantern to make sure the light was functioning, but when I reached the top, I found the glass fogged from the inside. Wet handprints smudged across the panels, leading to the outer catwalk. I froze. A figure appeared in the fog. He was tall, drenched, and barefoot. His face was pale and gaunt. His eyes seemed empty, but somehow aware of me. I tried to speak, but my voice caught. When I looked away for just a moment, he was gone, but the handprints remained. The radio crackled with static, then a voice whispered my name. Daniel. It was warped, distorted, almost as if it were underwater. My stomach turned. Nobody else was on the island. I started investigating the lighthouse's history. Records showed that in the 1920s, a keeper named Jonathan Bell had vanished during a storm. They never found his body. Local lore said he'd been so dedicated to keeping the light burning that he refused to leave, even in death. That night, around 2 a.m., I heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs. I knew the lighthouse was empty. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sounds down the spiral staircase. Each step echoed, but the steps themselves, wet, deliberate, didn't match my own. At the base, I found footprints leading to the generator room. They were bare, caked in mud and salt, but human-sized. I called out, my voice shaking, but there was no answer, only the hum of the generator and the wind rattling the doors. Suddenly, the main light flickered and went out. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to restart the generator, hands trembling. Behind me, I heard the wet dragging of feet across the metal floor. I turned, flashlight shaking, but saw nothing. Then the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the dim light. The sound of someone sobbing echoed through the generator room. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel a presence. Cold, oppressive, and watching. I ran back up the stairs to the lantern room and locked the door. The storm outside was violent, but it didn't matter. Something was inside the lighthouse with me. I could hear it moving below, dragging itself along the stairs, scraping the metal with long, wet nails. Hours passed like this. Each time I tried to descend, the dragging followed. I could hear whispers now, taunting, pleading, and calling my name. I tried to sleep in the lantern room, but exhaustion and fear offered no relief. When dawn came, I ventured down cautiously. The footprints were still there, but the dragging had stopped. The door to the maintenance tunnel, normally secured, was ajar. Inside, the water had risen slightly, pooling on the metal floor. In the dim light, I saw a figure crouched in the corner, wet, pale, with hollow eyes staring at me. I screamed and retreated. The ferry was due that afternoon. I barely slept, keeping my eyes on the staircase and the tunnel. When Lewis arrived, I begged him to take me away. He looked at me with a knowing sadness. "You saw him, didn't you?" Jonathan Bell never left. Some nights he still walks the tower, making sure the light never goes out. I left the lighthouse that day, but I couldn't erase the memories. Nights later, I'd still dream of wet footsteps behind me, dragging across metal stairs, whispers calling my name. And sometimes in the distance along the coast, I could see the beam of the lighthouse cutting through the fog, and I knew he was still there, watching, waiting, keeping the light burning. Story the end. The first time I set foot in the lighthouse, it was late October, and the Atlantic was already wild. I had taken a temporary job as the night keeper after the previous one vanished without explanation, something the local papers barely mentioned. The thought of being alone for weeks, surrounded only by the sound of crashing waves and wind, seemed thrilling at first. By the end of my first night, I knew I had been terribly wrong. The lighthouse sat on a jagged cliff in Maine, its white paint peeling in the salty air. The structure was narrow and tall, spiraling up like a twisted tower, with the light at the top swinging tirelessly over the churning ocean. The living quarters were cramped, one small room with a bed, a table, and a chair. The kitchen was little more than a nook, with a stove and a sink. The air smelled of damp wood, salt, and old rust, and it made the hairs on my neck prickle from the moment I walked in. Frank, the day caretaker, briefed me quickly. He was an older man, stooped and quiet, and he avoided eye contact like he was afraid I might see something. "Keep the light running. Check the generator. Log everything. Nights are long, but quiet," he said, his words hollow. I nodded, trying not to show how nervous I already was. He left just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving me alone with the lighthouse, the cliffs, and the ocean. The first few hours were peaceful. I checked the lamp, ensured the generator was stable, and sat in my quarters reading. Outside, the waves crashed endlessly, a constant, deafening rhythm. Around midnight, I first heard it, a soft, dragging sound from the upper floor. At first, I told myself it was the wind or the old building settling, but the sound was deliberate, slow, and heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway was empty, silent. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but there was no sign of movement. I checked the rooms, every corner, the tower itself. Everything was exactly as it should be, but my unease didn't dissipate. Something about the silence felt wrong, too deep, too complete. By the second night, the noises had increased. Around 2 a.m., I heard a voice, a soft whisper calling my name. "Alex." It was so faint I thought I imagined it. Then it came again, slightly louder. "Alex, come upstairs." My pulse quickened. I froze in my chair, hand gripping the logbook. After a long moment, I forced myself to rise and follow the sound. At the top of the stairs, in the dim moonlight filtering through the narrow windows, I saw a figure. It was shadowy, barely solid, and it didn't move. but I could feel it watching me. I blinked, and it vanished. My rational mind told me it was a trick of the shadows, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. The following nights were a nightmare. I would hear the dragging sound move across the floors, hear whispers that sometimes called my name, sometimes pleaded for help. Objects would shift when I wasn't looking. A cup would be on the counter 1 minute and on the floor the next. The lamp itself, which was automated, began flickering unpredictably. Once it turned off completely, leaving the tower in pitch blackness while the storm raged outside. One night, the closet in the kitchen caught my attention. I had avoided it before, but a voice whispered from inside, "Help me, please." I froze. The rational part of me screamed not to open it, but my curiosity overpowered me. I opened the door. Nothing. Just the empty shelves. I slammed it shut, shaking. That night, I barely slept. The following week, the shadows grew more distinct. I could see them in the corners of my eyes, sometimes standing at the end of the hallway or at the top of the spiral stairs. They were pale, elongated, their eyes black and hollow. They didn't move like humans. They glided, impossibly fast, but silently. One night, I saw them outside the windows, hundreds of them, their faces pressed against the glass, staring in. Around 3 a.m., the dragging grew into a heavy, thudding rhythm, moving closer to my room. I grabbed my flashlight and ran up the stairs. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogged in the beam of light. At the top, I saw one of them, a figure hunched and staring at me with a cruel, empty smile. Its eyes were nothing but darkness. I froze, paralyzed. Then it started moving toward me. I ran. Down the stairs, across the narrow hallways, slamming doors behind me. It followed, silent but relentless. I made it to my room and locked the door, pressed against it as my heart pounded in my chest. I stayed there until dawn, listening to the silence, knowing it had not left, only waiting. Frank came back after a week and noticed my state. He gave me no advice, no comfort. Some things you don't want to see, Alex. The lighthouse, it's not just a building. It watches, it waits. People come and go, but some never leave. I didn't argue. I packed up and left that very night. The road to town was wet and slick from the constant spray of the Atlantic. I told myself I was done, that the nightmare was behind me. But even now, years later, when the wind howls and the rain taps against the windows, I hear the faint dragging of footsteps, the whispers of voices calling my name, and I see shadows move in the corner of my vision. Sometimes when I drive along the coast at night, I see a distant light spinning in the stormy darkness. My stomach tightens, and I know the lighthouse still waits, waiting for the next keeper, the next soul brave or foolish enough to take the night shift. And if I ever went back, I know without doubt that whatever I saw would still be there, watching, waiting, hungering. Story the end. I arrived at Seacliff Lighthouse in late September of 2003, a week before the fall equinox. The posting had come unexpectedly. I'd applied on a whim, thinking a solitary job on the Maine coast might be the perfect escape from the chaos of my life in Boston. I was wrong. The lighthouse was perched on a jagged promontory, waves smashing into the rocks below, sending up sprays of foam that could reach the windows on stormy days. The structure was classic, whitewashed stone, a spiraling metal staircase leading to the lantern room, and a small attached keeper's cottage that smelled faintly of salt and mildew. I met my relief officer, a middle-aged man named Carl, who would stay only one night to show me the ropes before leaving me alone for my week-long rotation. His eyes lingered on me a moment too long when I asked about the night shift. "Most folks don't last more than a few nights," he said casually. "Not because of the work. It's the isolation and the things you hear." I laughed nervously. "I've worked nights before. Isolation isn't a problem." He didn't smile. He just shook his head. "You'll see." The first 2 nights were uneventful. Routine checks, the foghorn, the generator, cleaning, writing logs. The lighthouse felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The floorboards creaked, the metal staircase groaned under my weight, and the wind carried a constant, low moan that seemed almost like a voice. I told myself I was imagining it, but I noticed the air inside the tower always smelled faintly of seaweed and something else. Something old. The third night, the unease started. Around 1:30 a.m., I was inspecting the lantern room when I heard footsteps on the spiral stairs behind me. I turned sharply. Nothing. I called out, "Hello?" but my voice disappeared in the wind. I waited, listening. Only the floorboards creaking, but I knew I hadn't moved. Later, when I sat down at my desk in the cottage to write my log, the faint scratching of nails on wood echoed from above, coming from the lantern room. I climbed the stairs slowly, flashlight in hand. The lantern itself was on, rotating, its beams sweeping the dark sea. The staircase was empty. The sounds stopped the moment I reached the top. That night, I tried sleeping in the small bedroom. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of the foghorn blowing irregularly, not its usual rhythm. Then I heard whispering, so soft I almost couldn't believe it. I strained to listen. It sounded like a man's voice calling, "Turn it on, turn it on, bring it back." I jumped up and ran to the lantern room. The light was still functioning normally. I checked the generator, the controls, everything fine. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble writing the log the next morning. The fourth night, the weather turned foul. A storm came off the ocean, lightning striking far off and illuminating the tower in quick bursts. Around midnight, I went up to check the light. The wind was deafening, the rain slapping against the glass like fists. As I stepped onto the balcony outside the lantern room, I noticed footprints in the wet metal grating. They were bare, long, and irregular. I froze. The balcony had been empty moments before, and I was alone. I followed the trail around the circular catwalk. It led to a shadowed corner where the light barely reached. There was nothing, no one, but the air grew inexplicably colder, and I felt like I was being watched. Later, during the height of the storm, the power flickered. The backup generator kicked in, but then the lantern room light died completely. I was enveloped in darkness, except for the storm outside. Then I saw movement through the fogged glass, a tall figure standing on the rocks below the tower, facing the sea. Even through the sheets of rain, I could make out the shape of a man in old-fashioned clothing. His coat was soaked, and he didn't move as the waves crashed around him. I grabbed the emergency radio. "Coast Guard, this is Keeper at Seacliff Lighthouse. I need assistance. Someone's outside." I paused as the figure lifted its head and slowly turned toward me. Its face was pale, almost featureless, the eyes a milky white. I dropped the radio. The figure vanished the next instant, swallowed by the storm. I spent the rest of the night huddled near the generator. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. The following morning, I inspected the grounds. There were footprints in the sand leading to the cliff edge, bare, deep, and vanishing suddenly as if the person had been lifted by the air. Nothing else. I didn't report it. Nobody would believe me. Over the next several nights, the pattern repeated. Shadows in the lantern room, whispers drifting through the cottage, and the occasional glimpse of a man standing on the rocks. Once, I thought I saw him climbing the spiral staircase. I ran to the top. Nothing. I began to read the old logbooks stored in a cabinet in the cottage. Most were mundane entries about fog, generator maintenance, and light inspections. But one journal from 1947 caught my eye. The keeper, Robert Lang, wrote about the man who waits in the storm, a shadow that followed him during the night shifts, sometimes appearing on the rocks, sometimes inside the tower. Lang's final entry was chilling. "I cannot leave. He will not let me. The light belongs to him. If it fails, he will come for me." I realized I was trapped in the same cycle. The man didn't care about storms or logic. He simply wanted the light. He wanted the tower. The final night came on October 1st with another storm. The waves were monstrous, thunder shaking the foundation, lightning casting the tower into ghostly flashes. Around 2 a.m., I heard the faint sound of the stairs creaking. I grabbed the revolver in the supply closet and climbed slowly. The lantern light flickered, struggling against the wind. Halfway up, I saw him, standing at the base of the stairs, soaked, pale, eyes white, mouth moving as if speaking without sound. My heart raced. I raised the gun. He tilted his head. I swear he smiled. And then he vanished. The lantern died, plunging the tower into darkness. The generator sputtered and died. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I backed into a corner, holding the gun, waiting. The whispers returned, louder this time, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Turn it on, bring it back." I don't remember how long I stayed like that. When the relief keeper arrived 2 days later, the generator had started on its own, and the lantern was shining steadily over the sea. I was shaking, exhausted, unable to speak. I packed my bag and left immediately, never returning. Years later, I learned that Seacliff Lighthouse had a long history of night shift keepers disappearing, always during storms. The Coast Guard eventually automated it completely, but locals still tell stories of a pale man standing on the rocks, watching the sea, waiting for the light to go out. I sometimes think about him. I still wake in the middle of the night to the sound of wind and distant waves, and I swear I can hear faint whispers calling through the dark. Story the end. It started the day I was assigned to the night shift at Black Rock Point Lighthouse, a towering structure perched on the edge of Maine's jagged coastline. The previous keeper had retired abruptly, citing personal reasons, and no one from the Coast Guard elaborated further. I was 28, used to solitude from years working as a night security guard, and thought I could handle it. I was wrong. The first evening was deceptively calm. The lighthouse's massive lamp rotated, its golden beam cutting a slow circle across the pitch-black ocean. I inspected the machinery, filled out the logs, and settled into the small quarters attached to the base of the tower. Outside, waves smashed against the rocks with a steady roar and gulls called in the distance. Inside, the lighthouse creaked and sighed, the sounds settling in my bones as though the building itself were alive. By the second night, the subtle unease began. I was taking notes when I heard a faint knock, like fingernails tapping lightly on metal. I froze, listening. The wind rattled the windows, the chain to the foghorn groaned, but this knock wasn't outside. It came from the tower's interior, somewhere above me. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the spiral staircase. Nothing. Every step echoed, but there were no footprints, no shadows, nothing to explain the sound. I laughed nervously, muttering that it was probably just the old lighthouse settling. The third night was worse. Around midnight, the beam caught a figure on the cliff edge, barely visible against the dark rocks. At first, I thought it was a fisherman, but the figure didn't move naturally. It was too tall, too thin, and its posture was unnervingly stiff. I watched for several minutes. It simply stared, unmoving, before vanishing into the fog. My stomach churned. I told myself it was my imagination, but the memory lingered like a pulse in the back of my skull. On the fourth night, while performing a routine check on the light's lens, I noticed scratches along the metal railing of the spiral staircase, scratches that hadn't been there before. They were long, jagged, and looked fresh. I ran my fingers along them, feeling an almost imperceptible vibration, like the metal was resonating with something unseen. That's when I heard it. A whisper. "Get out!" I spun around, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The staircase was empty. My heart raced as I backed down the steps. The whisper came again, more insistent, though no sound accompanied it, only the oppressive feeling of being watched. By the fifth night, sleep deprivation began to gnaw at my mind. The isolation was intense. No one came to visit, no supply boats arrived at night, and the foghorns only echoed the loneliness. That night, the whispering escalated. It seemed to come from every direction at once, from the walls, the floor, even the air. I scribbled frantic notes in the log, trying to maintain a record in case someone didn't believe me later. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, echoing down the spiral staircase. I called out, assuming it might be an inspector who had come in early. Nothing. I reached the top, flashlight shaking in my hands. The lantern room was empty, but the door leading out to the catwalk was ajar, even though I was certain I had locked it. The wind was calm. There had been no storm. I tried to keep my composure. I tried to rationalize. But then the beam of the lighthouse faltered, flickering rapidly before going dark for a heartbeat too long, and in that brief, suffocating darkness I saw it. A silhouette, humanoid but distorted, standing on the spiral staircase, too tall to be human. Its head tilted unnaturally, and where its face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, dropping my flashlight. When I picked it up again, the figure was gone. The staircase was empty. The room was silent, except for the faint whisper, "Don't leave. Stay." I locked myself in the keeper's quarters, barricading the door with a chair. I could hear movement outside, scraping, shifting, like someone pacing in the shadows just beyond the walls. The sense of being watched was suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the thought of abandoning the lighthouse to unlit seas felt impossible. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat against the wall, listening. The whispers continued, growing louder, more urgent, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that were almost human. Sometimes I thought I could hear my own voice among them, distorted, echoing from somewhere deep within the tower. Around 3 a.m., a loud thump shook the quarters. The door rattled, as if someone or something was trying to get in. I held my breath, heart pounding, listening to the sound of claws or fingernails scraping along the wood. Then silence. A long, oppressive silence that pressed against my skull. When dawn broke, I ventured out. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints, no marks, nothing to explain the night's terror. Only the lingering cold, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I wanted to leave, but I had promised to complete my shift. The following nights brought more manifestations. Shadows moving just out of the corner of my vision, objects shifting slightly when I wasn't looking, the whispers growing louder, forming words I couldn't understand. Once, I woke to find the logbook pages torn and scattered across the floor, words I had written smeared and distorted. One night, during a particularly fierce storm, the lighthouse shuddered violently. The light flickered, and I heard a low, resonant moan coming from the spiral staircase. It wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, vibrating through the stone. I ran to the top, fearing structural collapse, but the lantern room was intact. That's when I saw it, a tall, dark figure, its limbs long and thin, standing just beyond the light. Its face was featureless, yet I felt its gaze pierce through me. I tried to speak, to move, but my body froze. The figure tilted its head, and for a moment I could feel an intelligence behind those blank contours, a malign awareness. I ran down the stairs, stumbling, terrified. By the time I reached the keeper's quarters, it had vanished. But I found something else, a wet, elongated handprint pressed into the wall, far taller than any human hand. I touched it, and the chill was immediate, unnatural. The stone beneath my fingers seemed to pulse slightly, like it remembered the presence of something living. I called the Coast Guard the next morning, requesting an immediate transfer. They came with a team, inspected the lighthouse, and found nothing unusual. No footprints, no damage, nothing. I wanted to scream, to tell them I wasn't imagining it, but the words caught in my throat. I left immediately, feeling a weight lift as I drove inland. Years later, I learned that every keeper who stayed multiple nights at Black Rock Point experienced something similar. Shadows, whispers, faceless figures, objects moving on their own. Some quit mid-shift, some vanished entirely. I never went back, and I warn anyone who considers the night shift there, it's not just isolation or fatigue. Something watches, something waits. Even now, when the wind howls against my windows, I swear I hear the faint creak of a spiral staircase, the whispering of voices in the dark, and the pulse of something ancient, patient, waiting for the next keeper to climb the tower and notice. And I know, without doubt, that it will be there, faceless and patient, no matter how far I run. Story the end. It was mid-October when I got the call for the temporary night shift at the Lighthouse off the coast of Maine. I was working part-time security jobs around Portland, and the old Coast Guard station had contracted me for what they claimed was a short-term maintenance oversight while the regular keeper was on leave. I didn't ask too many questions at the time. The pay was good, the isolation sounded appealing, and I had always been curious about lighthouses. I pictured myself sipping coffee in a warm tower, watching the waves crash, maybe jotting in a journal. The reality turned out to be far darker. I arrived late afternoon, my truck tires crunching on the gravel road that led out to the lighthouse. It was one of those weather-beaten structures you see in old postcards, white paint peeling, the spiral tower rising high above the rocky shore, and the windows reflecting the gray of the Atlantic. A small boathouse and an attached cabin were the only other buildings nearby. The caretaker who met me, a wiry old man named Frank, had the sort of stare that made you want to apologize for breathing too loudly. He showed me to the cabin where I'd be sleeping. "The nights here are quiet," he said, his voice clipped, "except when they aren't. You'll figure that out soon enough." I laughed nervously, assuming he was joking, but there was a strange edge to his smile that made me pause. The first night started like any other night shift. I patrolled the grounds, checked the light mechanism, and monitored the foghorn. There was a certain rhythm to it, a monotony that almost lulls you into a meditative state. But the ocean was rougher than I expected, and the wind carried a biting chill that went straight through my coat. I kept thinking I saw shapes moving in the spray, but chalked it up to shadows and fatigue. By midnight, I was starting to feel the isolation creep in, a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure around my skull. It started subtly around 2 a.m. The lights in the tower flickered once or twice. I went up to check, expecting a loose bulb or a faulty switch. Everything seemed fine. When I descended, I heard a faint tapping, like someone walking on the gravel outside, but the cabin was empty. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and scanned the shoreline. Nothing. The wind had died down momentarily, and the sound vanished. I laughed at myself, muttering, "You're just jumpy. Big empty ocean, nothing to see." The following nights got worse. I began noticing small things. The foghorn would sometimes go off for no reason. Long, mournful wails that didn't match any schedule. Footsteps echoed in the tower when I was alone. Objects in the cabin were slightly out of place. A chair turned. A flashlight moved. Once, I swear I saw a figure at the edge of the cliff, a tall, dark silhouette staring out at the waves. By the time I blinked, it was gone. My phone barely had service, and I didn't want to call Frank in the middle of the night, partly because I didn't want to seem crazy, and partly because I wasn't sure he'd even pick up. The third night was when it became undeniably wrong. Around 1:30 a.m., I was up in the tower checking the lights mechanism. The rotation of the lamp was uneven, jolting slightly against the bearings. I leaned over to inspect it, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow descend the spiral stairs. My first thought was Frank coming to check on me, but the shadow was too tall, too thin. I called out, but only the wind answered. Then I heard the whisper, a breathy, almost human voice muttering something under the wind's howl. I froze. My flashlight shook in my hand as I swung it toward the stairs. Empty. No one. But the whisper came again, this time clearer. Leave. Now. I spent the next hour sitting in the tower, too scared to move, too afraid to descend. Eventually, I convinced myself it was stress, the isolation, the wind messing with my head. Morning brought a bright sun, gulls screaming overhead, and the lighthouse suddenly seemed normal again. I told myself I was imagining it. I couldn't let fear win. It was just a lighthouse, after all. That night, things escalated further. Around midnight, I heard a scraping noise outside, like nails on wood, coming from the boathouse. I went to investigate, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. Inside, everything was normal, except the ladder to the roof had been rotated, leaning in a way that would have been impossible if I had left it the way I remembered. I checked my notes, my memory, even my own sanity. Nothing explained it. As I turned to leave, the wind carried a low, guttural growl from somewhere behind the building. I froze, shining the light into the fog, and saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. Tall, black, and impossibly still. The shape crouched, then disappeared. I bolted back to the cabin, heart pounding, hands raw from gripping the railing. I locked the door, but sleep didn't come. Every creak, every whisper, every small bump of the house against the wind felt amplified, like it was mocking me. On the fifth night, I was halfway through my shift when I decided to try to record the sounds, to prove to myself or anyone else that I wasn't losing it. I set up a small digital recorder in the tower and left it running. By 2 a.m., the wind was unusually calm, the ocean unnervingly still. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the spiral stairs. I grabbed the recorder and ran down, but the steps followed me, echoing behind me. I reached the bottom and turned, flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing, only the recorder vibrating lightly on the floor. I picked it up, pressed play, and my blood ran cold. The recording captured every step, every pause, and every whisper. Leave before it's too late. By the sixth night, I was convinced something was trying to drive me out. Maybe the ghosts of former keepers, sailors, or unknown victims of the ocean. I had heard stories of old lighthouses being haunted, stories I never took seriously. Now, the folklore seemed real. That night, as I patrolled the perimeter, I saw shapes moving in the fog, thin, elongated, drifting just above the ground. They didn't walk, they glided. And the eyes, so many eyes, glinting in the moonlight, following me wherever I went. I tried speaking, asking if they wanted something, but only silence answered, accompanied by that deep, guttural growl beneath the waves. Sleep became impossible. I tried sitting in the cabin during the day. hoping daylight would erase what I had experienced, but shadows lingered even then, bending oddly, refusing to conform to the sun. I tried calling Frank to come check in, but he didn't answer. His absence was increasingly unnerving. He had seemed wary of the night before, almost fearful. The thought occurred to me that maybe he had known more than he let on. On my seventh night, I had a near-complete mental breakdown. The light in the tower went out unexpectedly, plunging the room into darkness despite my manual checks moments before. I scrambled to fix it, but the wind carried whispers that I could not ignore. Voices overlapping, malevolent and angry. And then I saw it, or them. Faces pressed against the tower windows, pale, distorted, eyes hollow and unblinking. They didn't move like humans, they twisted unnaturally. I fell back, hitting my head on the railing, and for a moment I was certain I had been knocked unconscious. When I came to, the tower was empty, but the oppressive feeling remained, as if the air itself had been tainted. By the eighth night, I couldn't stay in the tower. I refused to patrol. I stayed in the cabin, trying to convince myself to leave, but my truck had a dead battery. I heard the foghorn sound at irregular intervals, almost rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Shadows moved along the edges of the cabin. I started talking to them, bargaining. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just leave me alone." The shadows seemed to respond, moving closer, circling the cabin, sometimes slipping under the door. I learned quickly that speaking to them only invited attention. It was during that night I realized I was not alone in a conventional sense. They weren't just spirits. They were entities tied to the location, feeding off fear, testing boundaries. I began marking doors and windows with chalk, hoping to contain them, but the marks were smeared by the next morning. They didn't obey physical laws. Mirrors showed me glimpses of them when they weren't even in the room. I started keeping a journal, not to record events, but to remind myself I was still alive, still grounded in reality, though the writing began to smear in ways I couldn't explain, letters elongating, words twisting unnaturally. On the ninth night, I finally saw Frank again, but he was changed. He emerged from the fog, but his face was pale, stretched unnaturally. His eyes glowed faintly, unblinking. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice layered with an echo that wasn't human. I froze. "You should have left," he repeated, the words vibrating through my skull. He raised a hand, pointing toward the tower. I looked, and in the lens of the lighthouse I saw a mass of shadows, swirling, writhing, almost alive. I realized the light itself was no longer a tool, but a beacon, attracting whatever had haunted the place for decades. And somehow, I had been feeding it, night after night. I didn't sleep at all that night. I barricaded myself in the cabin, listening to the foghorn's cries, the scraping, the whispers, and the occasional scream of something distant yet near. I watched the shadows move closer, pushing against walls, windows, doors. I could feel the cold, wet air of the Atlantic creeping in, carrying with it the distinct metallic tang of fear. And when dawn broke, it offered no relief. The morning sun did not disperse them. Instead, it revealed just how many there were, figures lining the cliffs, standing in the shallow surf, all facing me. By the 10th night, I knew I had to escape. I managed to push my truck onto the gravel, starting it with the last of my patience and fear. As I drove away, the lighthouse receded into the fog, but I could still feel the eyes on me. I never went back. Months later, I learned from the Coast Guard that the lighthouse had been automated years ago, and no one was assigned night shifts. Frank was never listed as an employee. Locals whispered about disappearances, strange lights, and missing vessels, but there was no concrete record. I had lived through what no one else could explain, and every night since, when the wind howls against my window or the fog rolls in off the ocean, I hear it. The faint whisper, always telling me to leave. Before it's too late. Story the end. It was early November of 2021 when I got the offer that changed everything. I had been working maintenance shifts at small marinas and docks around Cape Elizabeth, Maine, barely scraping by. The email came from an old maritime contractor I'd worked with before, asking if I'd be interested in taking a 2-week contract keeping night watch at an old lighthouse that was being restored for tourism. I didn't hesitate. The pay was more than decent, and all I had to do was stay overnight, make sure no one vandalized the property, and check the power generators twice a night. The lighthouse was called Calder's Watch. and it sat on a small, rocky peninsula jutting out into the Atlantic, about a mile from the nearest road. I drove out there the following Monday afternoon in my pickup, the sky heavy with low gray clouds. The access road wound through pine forest and salt marsh, opening suddenly to a wide, wind-blasted clearing where the tower stood, white paint flaking, the glass lantern blackened from years of disuse. The adjacent keeper's cottage looked barely habitable, with warped shingles and a front porch that sagged like it was exhaling. A man in a yellow slicker was waiting for me by the door. "You're the new night guy?" he asked. His voice was raspy, like he'd spent too much time in the wind. "Yeah, I'm Tom," I said, shaking his hand. He nodded. "Name's Eric. I'm finishing up the day shift work. Don't stay up in the tower longer than you have to, all right? The structure's sound, but she creaks something awful. Wind plays tricks up there." He led me inside and showed me the basics: generator in the shed, fuse box, radio to call the mainland crew if I needed anything. Before leaving, he added something strange. "If the fog gets thick, don't answer the voices. Just stay inside. That sound carries funny across the water." Then he left without another word. I didn't think much of it then. Old-timers always had some superstitious nonsense about the sea. That first night was calm. I made rounds with my flashlight, listening to the rhythmic crash of waves below. The air smelled like rust and salt. Inside the tower, the spiral staircase echoed with each footstep, the metal groaning softly. I checked the lighthousing. Dead, as expected. The restoration team hadn't rewired it yet. I sat in the cottage afterward, reading by lamplight, half hoping for a storm to make things interesting. Around 2 a.m., I heard something strange. It was faint at first, a tapping sound from upstairs in the tower. I assumed it was loose glass in the lantern room or the wind knocking debris around. But when I climbed the stairs to check, the sound stopped. I looked around with my flashlight. Everything was still. When I started back down, I could have sworn I heard soft footsteps following me. I turned, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been wind and echo. But the second night, the tapping returned. This time, it was more deliberate. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 3 more. I climbed up again, annoyed more than afraid, and noticed condensation forming inside the lantern glass. My breath caught when I saw faint smudges, handprints, on the inside of the glass. Small ones. Too small to be mine. I wiped them away and told myself maybe Eric or one of the workers had left them there. By the third night, the fog rolled in thick as milk. I couldn't see more than a few feet outside the cottage. The air felt heavy, pressing in on the windows. Around midnight, the foghorn down by the shore started blaring on its own. It hadn't worked in years, Eric said. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, boots crunching on gravel. The foghorn went silent the moment I reached the shore. I stood there listening. That's when I heard the whisper, soft, almost like someone calling my name. "Tom." I spun around, light cutting through the mist. "Eric, that you?" No answer, just the ocean. Then again, closer this time. "Tom." The voice was female. My heart hammered. I backed toward the cottage. "Who's there?" A shape moved in the fog, tall, thin, hair hanging in wet strands. I could make out the pale suggestion of a face before it faded back into the mist. I ran inside and slammed the door, locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold the flashlight steady. For the next hour, I sat in the corner, every muscle tense, listening to the wind moan outside. Occasionally, I thought I heard soft knocks on the walls, circling the building. By dawn, the fog lifted, and the world looked normal again. But I noticed something that froze me. The footprints. Wet, bare footprints leading from the shore to my door, small and human. That morning, I called Eric on the radio. "Hey, do people ever come out here at night? Locals, maybe?" There was a long pause. "No one comes there after dark," he said flatly. "Why?" I hesitated, then lied. "Nothing, just heard something." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Don't go down to the rocks after sunset. Not unless you want to join them." The line crackled, and he was gone. I didn't know what that meant until later. The fourth night, I dreamt I was in the tower again, staring through the fog at the ocean. A figure was standing on the rocks below, waving up at me. When I tried to wave back, the figure smiled, wide, too wide, and something about the eyes made me jolt awake. I sat upright in bed, heart pounding. That's when I heard it. Someone was walking upstairs in the tower. I grabbed the flashlight and knife I kept on the table and moved toward the stairs. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I called out, "Eric, that you?" No response. As I climbed, the temperature dropped. The air smelled like seawater and rot. My flashlight beam shook across the stone walls, illuminating cracks and damp streaks. The sound came from the lantern room above. I pushed the hatch open and stepped inside. The handprints were back, dozens of them now, covering the glass. And in the middle of the room, just in front of the lens, stood a woman. Her hair was soaked, her dress tattered, dripping seawater onto the floor. Her skin was gray-blue, eyes hollow but somehow alive. For a second, I couldn't move. She raised her head slowly and met my gaze. When she spoke, her voice sounded like the ocean itself, low gurgling, full of distance. "Light it," she whispered. My voice caught. "What?" "The light. Light it." Then she took a step forward, her feet leaving wet prints on the stone. I stumbled back and fell down 2 steps, hitting my shoulder hard. When I looked up again, she was gone. Only the water remained, pooling around the base of the light. I spent the rest of that night sitting outside, too terrified to go back inside either the tower or the cottage. The foghorn never sounded again that night, but I could hear faint humming, like a woman singing, carried faintly on the wind. By the 5th night, I'd stopped sleeping. I found old records in the cottage, maintenance logs, letters from the 1940s, even a few newspaper clippings. One headline read, "Lighthouse Keeper's Wife Lost at Sea, Body Never Recovered." Her name was Lydia Calder, the wife of the lighthouse's first keeper, Benjamin Calder. She'd gone missing during a storm in 1943 after reportedly climbing the rocks to look for her husband's boat. Her body was never found, but rumors claimed people still saw her in the fog near the lighthouse, calling for help. That night, when the fog rolled in again, I swore I heard her crying outside the door. "Please, help me." I sat frozen at the table, gripping my flashlight. Then came a knock. Slow, gentle. "Tom," it was her voice again. I whispered to myself, "It's not real." But the knob began to turn. I leapt forward and jammed a chair under the handle. Something on the other side pushed, softly but steadily. The door creaked under the pressure. Then, after a minute, it stopped. When I looked down at the floor, there was seawater seeping in through the gap under the door. I didn't open it until daylight. The porch was soaked. My boots left prints in puddles that stretched down toward the cliff edge. The smell of salt was overwhelming. The 6th night, I made up my mind to leave. I packed my bag, waited for dawn, and hiked back toward the forest road. But when I reached it, the path was gone, swallowed by fog that seemed to have no end. I turned around thinking I'd walked too far, but no matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the lighthouse. That's when I realized I wasn't trapped by land or water. I was trapped by her. That night, I stayed in the tower, determined to confront whatever was happening. I sat by the lantern, clutching my flashlight, waiting. Around 1 a.m., the temperature plummeted. The fog outside glowed faintly under the moonlight. And then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from it, dozens of them. People, standing on the rocks below, staring up at me. Their faces were pale and swollen, their clothes heavy and dripping. In the middle stood Lydia. She raised her arm, pointing toward the unlit beacon. "Light it," she said again, her voice carrying over the surf. "Light it, or we will." Before I could react, the beacon flickered on by itself, blazing to life. The machinery screamed, gears grinding though no power ran to them. The beam spun once, twice, then froze, shining directly into the fog. And in that light, I saw what it illuminated. Hundreds of faces beneath the waves, staring upward, mouths open, eyes wide. I ran. By the time I made it back to the cottage, the foghorn was wailing nonstop. The windows rattled. Every light in the house flickered. I locked the door, crouched on the floor, and covered my ears, but I could still hear her voice, whispering through the cracks in the walls. "You stayed too long." I must have passed out at some point, because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The fog had lifted. The light was off. Everything was quiet. I walked down to the shore, half dazed, and found something on the rocks, an old photograph, waterlogged and faded. It showed a man and woman standing in front of the lighthouse. On the back, written in faint pencil, were the words, "Benjamin and Lydia Calder, 1942. I left that morning on foot, found my way back to the road by sheer luck, and never returned. A few weeks later, I saw a local news story. A group of tourists visiting the restored lighthouse claimed they saw a woman standing in the tower window during a foggy afternoon. The staff said no one had been on duty that day. I turned off the TV and moved inland. Even now, sometimes at night, when the wind carries the faint echo of a foghorn, I wake up cold, certain I can hear her whispering just outside my window. Light it. Story the end. I had been working in maintenance for a few years, mostly fixing things nobody else wanted to touch. Old warehouses, abandoned factories, the occasional derelict boat. When the ad for a night keeper at a main lighthouse came up, I thought it would be a simple change of pace. Solitude, fresh air, a steady paycheck. The application process was brief. A phone call, a background check, and a stern warning that I'd be living alone on the island for weeks at a time. That was fine by me. I liked being alone. The lighthouse sat on a jagged strip of rock jutting into the Atlantic. The nearest town was a half-hour boat ride away. The locals had names for it I didn't understand at first. Dead Man's Beacon, the Widow's Eye. I laughed off the warnings. Stories of ghosts were just that, stories. I arrived in late September, the wind sharp, carrying a tang of salt and decay. The fog rolled in thick that evening, the island barely visible from the dock. The keeper who had been there before me, a man named Harlan, left the keys in a weathered tin box and said, "Just keep the light running and listen carefully to the wind. It tells more than you think." The first few nights were quiet. The light turned automatically, but I was instructed to make hourly checks, log everything in the logbook, and watch for unusual weather or ships. I read, tinkered with the machinery, and kept my phone charged, though signal was non-existent. The nights were long, the ocean dark and endless. I felt a strange peace at first. Then came the first knock. It was around midnight. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard it, a sharp, deliberate knock at the outer door. I froze, thinking Harlan had returned, but he wasn't due back for weeks. I approached cautiously. The wind howled against the rocks, masking all other sound. When I opened the door, there was nothing, just fog curling over the jagged ground. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and shone it across the rocks. Nothing. No footprints, no movement. I slammed the door and locked it. That night, the knocking repeated. Each time, I didn't open the door. Sometimes I heard faint whispering along with it, carried on the wind, almost melodic, almost pleading. It didn't make sense, yet it felt deliberate. My imagination, I told myself. That's all. By the third night, I began hearing footsteps inside the lighthouse. The wooden floors creaked in patterns that didn't match my movements. I lived in the annex beside the main tower, a small two-room space with a bed, kitchen, and desk. The steps seemed to climb the spiral staircase inside the tower itself, heavy and slow, stopping just beyond the railing outside my window. I would freeze, holding my breath, until the sound faded. I thought I was imagining things, until I saw them. It started with shadows. Flickers at the corner of my vision, long, thin, twisting unnaturally along the walls. The spiral staircase seemed to cast shapes that weren't mine. Once, I swore I saw a figure leaning over the balcony, pale and motionless, its face hidden by dark hair. I blinked, and it was gone. Another time, I went to the base of the tower and found handprints smeared on the stone, wet and dark, as if someone had been dragged along the rocks. The prints were different sizes, small and large, human but wrong. I began to keep a camera, thinking I could catch whatever was haunting me. At first it recorded nothing, blank rooms, empty staircases. But over time, figures started appearing, pale, barely visible, lingering in the frame for a second before vanishing. I noticed that they always seemed to be reaching for the light, their limbs outstretched in ways that made no sense. I stopped leaving the annex at night. I barricaded the door, kept every light on, and stayed awake as long as I could. Sleep brought nightmares. Standing in the lantern room while fog surged through the broken windows, countless figures crawling across the rocks, whispering my name. I would wake, drenched in sweat, to find the whispers continuing in the silence. One night, during a storm, the light failed. I scrambled to the lantern room, the stairs shaking under my feet. When I arrived, the bulb had shattered. I grabbed a handheld lamp and looked out over the balcony. The fog was thick, the wind screaming. And there they were, hundreds of pale, emaciated figures crawling across the rocks, some with arms raised, some dragging themselves forward along at the tower. The whispering was deafening. I tried to signal them anything, but they didn't respond. It wasn't human. They weren't alive in any way I understood. And then from behind me, the sound of wet, dragging footsteps inside the lantern room. I turned. Nothing. The flashlight flickered. I felt a cold touch on my shoulder and spun again. Still nothing. I ran back down the spiral staircase, tripping, falling, scraping my hands and knees. The whispers followed me, echoing off the walls, overlapping with the pounding of the storm outside. I made it to the annex and barricaded myself inside. The storm raged through the night, but the figures never left. I could hear them pacing outside, scratching at the walls, whispering in voices both human and alien. Morning came, though the light was dim through the storm clouds. I stepped outside cautiously. The rocks below were empty. The ocean was calm, almost unnaturally so. But the traces remained, the handprints, the smears of wet, dark matter along the stone, the faint indentations where something heavy had pressed against the ground. I didn't last long after that. I packed my things, got back on the skiff, and rowed to the mainland, refusing to look back. I called the maintenance company, told them I was quitting, and left. They didn't ask questions. They knew. Everyone knew. Even now, months later, I hear it. The whispering carried on the wind whenever the storms hit. I hear faint footsteps on the stairs in my apartment. Sometimes I wake to find objects moved, small items out of place, and I know, deep down, that one day they will come for me. The lighthouse doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. And the moment I thought I left it behind, I realized it had already followed me, carried in my mind, in my memories, in the whispering voices I cannot escape. Some nights, when the wind is right, I swear I can see the beam of the lighthouse shining far off in the darkness, sweeping the ocean as it always did, waiting for me to return. Story, the end. When I first took the job at the lighthouse, I thought it would be peaceful. Lonely, maybe, but quiet in a way that most jobs aren't anymore. I was 34, recently divorced, and trying to start over somewhere far away from everything that reminded me of the life I had just lost. The ad had read, "Nightkeeper wanted. Must be comfortable with isolation. Experience with mechanical or electrical systems preferred. Housing provided." It seemed like the universe had sent me something simple and steady, something that wouldn't talk back, wouldn't ask about my past, wouldn't care what mistakes I'd made. The lighthouse stood on a rocky stretch of coastline in northern Maine, where the Atlantic broke itself against black stone with relentless force. The nearest town was 15 miles inland, a place called Carrow's Point that looked like time had forgotten it sometime in the 70s. The lighthouse itself was old, built in 1887, and had been automated decades ago. But the Coast Guard still kept a human presence there for maintenance, monitoring, and emergencies. That human presence for 6 months was going to be me. I arrived in late October. The air was sharp with sea salt and cold mist, and the sky never seemed to completely brighten during the day. The man who met me there, Chief Petty Officer Harris, was an older Coast Guard guy with windburned skin and a permanent squint. He showed me around quickly, explaining how the generator worked, where the backup fuel was stored, and how to reset the rotating light if the motor ever failed. The system's mostly automated, he told me, but when it fails hard. The light has to stay on no matter what. Ships still come through this stretch. Not a lot, but enough. I nodded, taking in everything. The place smelled of oil and damp concrete. The spiral staircase was narrow and rusted in places. Every sound echoed strangely, as if the whole tower were hollow inside a much bigger empty space. "Any radio contact if something goes wrong?" I asked. He handed me a handheld VHF radio and pointed to a wall-mounted unit inside the small keeper's quarters adjacent to the tower. "Channel 16, but reception's spotty at night. Weather likes to screw with the signal." I laughed a little, thinking he was exaggerating. "Got it. And you said there's housing?" He pointed toward a squat brick building about 50 feet from the tower, a 2-bedroom place that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint since the Reagan administration. "There's a stove, a small fridge, and a generator connection. You'll have to run the heater sparingly unless you want to haul extra fuel from the shed every few nights." "Sounds manageable," I said. He gave me one last look before leaving, something like pity, or maybe warning. "Keep your routines tight," he said. "These old lighthouses, they get in your head after a while. Don't start skipping sleep." Then he gave a short wave, climbed into his truck, and drove off into the fog. By the time I unpacked and settled in, the sun had already dropped behind the gray horizon. I started the night shift around 7, checking the generator, making sure the beacon rotated properly, logging everything like the manual said. The foghorn went off every 30 seconds, a low, mournful sound that you could feel in your chest. It was repetitive, almost hypnotic. I remember thinking how easily a person could lose track of time out there. The first few nights passed quietly. The wind rattled the windows, the light turned its endless circles across the dark sea, and I grew used to the sound of the waves. I would sit in the observation room at the top of the tower, drink bad coffee, and read old logbooks from decades ago. The entries were routine. Light operational, weather calm, sea state rough, one vessel observed to the east. But one book from 1973 caught my attention. Near the end, the handwriting became shaky. The final entry read, "Light failed again at 2113. Heard voices near the rocks, no vessels in sight. Going to investigate." That was the last line. No signature. The next logbook didn't begin until 3 weeks later with a new keeper's name and handwriting. It didn't mention what happened to the previous one. I told myself not to think much of it. Old logbooks were full of strange things, men stuck alone for months, drinking too much, hearing the sea talk to them. It was just part of the isolation. But on my 9th night, something strange happened. Around 2 a.m., the light stopped rotating. The beam froze mid-sweep, leaving half the horizon dark. I went down to the machinery room, expecting to find a blown fuse or a jammed gear, but the mechanism was running fine, quiet, smooth, just not moving the way it should. When I reached to reset it, I heard what sounded like faint tapping above me, like footsteps echoing down the hollow core of the tower. I froze. The only entrance was locked from where I'd come in. I was the only one there. "Hello?" I called out. My voice bounced back, distorted by the curvature of the walls. The tapping stopped. I waited a full minute before climbing back up the stairs, one hand on my flashlight, the other gripping the railing. Each step creaked slightly, the sound lost quickly in the thick, damp air. When I reached the top, the room was empty, but the air felt wrong, like someone had just been there, breathing the same space. I pressed the reset button on the panel, and the motor kicked back in, making the light turn again. Everything seemed fine, but the hair on my arms stayed raised for the rest of the shift. When dawn came, I went outside to check the perimeter. The rocks below were slick with seawater, and the tide was high, slamming against the cliffs. That's when I noticed something in the shallows. A shape, pale and half covered by kelp, like a length of driftwood. But it wasn't driftwood. It was a human arm. My stomach turned cold. I scrambled down closer, but by the time I got a better look, a wave rolled over it and dragged it away. I radioed it in, breathless, but the signal crackled and broke apart in static. I tried again and got Harris after a few attempts. "Slow down," he said. "You found what?" "Something in the water," I said. "It looked like an arm. It was human." There was a pause on the line, then, "You're sure?" "I think so. It washed out before I could get a good look." He told me to log the incident and promised to send someone the next morning to check the coastline. I didn't sleep at all that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale shape rolling in the waves. By noon, a pair of Coast Guard guys arrived. They scanned the area, even sent a small drone out over the water, but found nothing. "Probably a seal carcass," one of them said. "They can look weird in the surf." But I'd seen enough dead animals in my time to know the difference between skin and blubber. That had been an arm. I didn't push the point. They left after an hour, and I was alone again. That night, the fog rolled in thick, so thick that even standing outside, I couldn't see the tower light clearly through it. The foghorn moaned constantly, vibrating through my chest. I decided to stay inside the tower most of the shift. Around midnight, the radio hissed with static, then a voice broke through, soft, distant, almost like it wasn't meant for me. "Back. Light. They see you." It was gone before I could reply. I tried to call back, but there was nothing. I wrote it in the logbook anyway, just in case. Then I noticed something that chilled me. The handwriting in my log entry, my own handwriting, looked almost identical to that shaky script from the 1973 entry I'd found earlier. My hand had been trembling without me realizing. I started keeping my phone's voice recorder on during the nights after that, just to capture any strange sounds. On playback the next day, I'd hear things, whispers under the wind, faint knocks that didn't match any movement I remembered making. One recording from November 3rd had something unmistakable. A voice right near the microphone, whispering, "Keep the light on." I tried to rationalize it, interference, radio bleed, my mind playing tricks, but every night it got worse. The light would falter at almost the exact same time, between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m. The fog would thicken, the generator would stutter, and somewhere in the tower I'd hear footsteps moving just ahead of me, always stopping when I got close. One night, around that same time, I decided to wait in the machinery room. I sat in the dark, flashlight off, just listening. After a few minutes, I heard the steps again. Slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs from above. They paused, then resumed, closer now. I held my breath as they reached the last few steps. The light from my flashlight caught a glimpse of something, bare feet, pale and wet, stepping down onto the concrete. I shouted and switched the beam upward, but there was nothing there. Just the stairs, empty, glistening with condensation. My hands shook as I backed away. I stayed outside the rest of the night, huddled near the housing building with a thermos of coffee and a flashlight that I never turned off. The foghorn bellowed above the waves, and every so often I thought I saw movement in the fog, something walking along the rocks near the base of the tower. The next morning, I found wet footprints on the stairs inside. They led from the top down to the bottom door, then stopped abruptly at the threshold. The door was locked from the inside. I called Harris again. This time he sounded irritated. "Look, we can't send people out there every time you hear something," he said. "It's an old place. It creaks. It echoes. You knew that when you took the job." "I'm telling you someone's in here," I said, "or something." "Take a few nights off," he suggested. "Come into town, get a hotel room, reset." But I couldn't. Someone had to keep the light running. And honestly, I was afraid that if I left it, whatever was happening there might get worse. The following night, the storm hit. Wind screamed around the tower. Waves slammed the rocks hard enough to make the whole structure shake. I stayed awake the entire shift, watching the light sweep through rain and spray. At exactly 2:13, the power went out. The generator cut off with a hard thud, and everything went black except for my flashlight. I sprinted down to the generator room, slipped on the wet floor, and nearly cracked my head open. When I got it restarted, I heard it again. Voices above me. Not footsteps this time, but actual voices. One low, one higher. They were whispering rapidly, like arguing. Then a woman's scream echoed through the stairwell, sharp, panicked, and close. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, flashlight jerking wildly. The sound stopped just as I reached the top, and the air up there was freezing, like someone had opened a door to the sea. The windows were fogged over from the inside. In the reflection, I thought I saw someone standing behind me, a woman with long, dark hair, her face gray and soaked, her mouth open like she was still screaming. I spun around, and no one was there. The next morning, I went outside, shaking so badly I could barely hold a coffee mug. Near the rocks, something had washed up again, a piece of weathered wood tangled in seaweed. When I got closer, I saw it wasn't wood. It was a part of a small rowboat with faded lettering that read, "Mary Ellen." When I called Harris later, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You didn't see the file, did you?" "What file?" He sighed. "There was an accident back in the 70s. A supply boat called the Mary Ellen went down during a storm near the Lighthouse. The keeper back then tried to signal them, but the light failed. 4 people died, 2 sailors, the keeper's wife, and his daughter. He went missing a week later. They said he walked into the water and never came out." My mouth went dry. "You said the wife and daughter died?" "That's what the report says." I hung up after that. I didn't want to hear any more. For the next few nights, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I kept the lights on in the quarters, the radio turned low, the generator humming nonstop. But exhaustion does strange things. One night, I woke up sitting in the chair by the window, staring out toward the tower. The light was off again. I looked at my watch. 2:14 a.m. I got up, threw on my coat, and stumbled out into the freezing wind. The fog was so thick I could barely see the base of the tower. When I reached the door, it was standing open. Inside, water pooled on the floor like the sea had seeped in. I climbed the stairs slowly, flashlight shaking. Halfway up, I heard someone whisper my name. "Daniel." My chest locked up. It was a woman's voice. "Daniel, you have to keep the light on." I froze. "Who's there?" No answer. Just that rhythmic sound of dripping water. At the top, the lens was still, the machinery dead silent. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw her reflection again, this time clearer. A woman in an old-fashioned raincoat, water streaming off her hair, her eyes hollow, standing just behind the glass outside the tower. Then I realized we were more than 60 feet above the ground. She lifted her hand and pressed it to the glass. My flashlight flickered, and the motor suddenly groaned to life by itself. The light started turning again. I staggered back, nearly falling down the stairs. When I dared to look again, she was gone. After that, things started blending together, nights and days. I stopped keeping logs. I just made sure the light never went out. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of her walking the shore, or a shadow moving through the fog at the edge of the rocks. Once, I found a child's shoe near the base of the tower, half buried in the sand. By December, I was barely eating. My radio had stopped working entirely, and the generator would sputter randomly, forcing me to refuel it in the middle of the night. Every time it faltered, I'd feel a panic so deep it bordered on madness. Like if that light went dark for even a second, something would come for me. On my last night there, a storm worse than any before hit the coast. The waves were so high they were breaking against the tower itself. The power failed around 2:10 again, and this time, the generator wouldn't start. The foghorn was dead. Everything was silent, except for the ocean roaring below. I climbed to the top with a lantern, trying to manually start the motor, but as soon as I touched the controls, I heard voices all around me. Hundreds of them, whispering, crying, gasping for air. The room filled with the smell of salt and decay. I turned and saw figures in the fog outside the windows. Men, women, children, faces pale, eyes black. They were staring in, their mouths moving in unison. "Keep the light on," they whispered. I screamed and twisted the crank. The light sputtered, flared, and then blazed to life, cutting through the storm. The figures vanished instantly. When the Coast Guard arrived the next morning, they found me collapsed on the floor near the base of the tower, soaked and delirious. They said the storm had knocked out power for miles. The generator was half flooded, the radio shorted out. They took me to the hospital in town. I told them everything. They said I must have been hallucinating from exhaustion, dehydration, stress. They had no record of any figures in the water, no sign of footprints or damage to the tower. But when they reviewed the recordings from my voice recorder, something I'd forgotten was even still running, they heard it too. The same whisper I'd captured before, only clearer now. A woman's voice saying, "Keep the light on." I quit the job that week. The lighthouse was decommissioned a few months later after the storm damage proved too costly to repair. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I pull up the live camera feed from the coastline. The tower's dark now, abandoned, but every so often, around 2:13 a.m., a light sweeps faintly across the sea, just once, before vanishing again. Story the end. The first time I saw the lighthouse, it looked more like a tomb than a tower. It stood on a narrow strip of rock about half a mile off the coast of Maine, gray stone streaked with salt and age, the glass housing at the top smudged and dull. I'd taken the night keeper job because I needed solitude. After a divorce and a few bad turns, being alone on a rock in the Atlantic sounded like therapy. The pay wasn't much, but it came with room and board and more silence than I'd had in years. The Coast Guard still operated it, though mostly automated now. My job was to monitor the systems, make sure the light rotated properly, record the hourly weather data, and keep an eye on the emergency radio. There were cameras and sensors, but when those went down, which they often did, it was on me to report anything unusual. I was told there had been a long line of keepers before me, but nobody stayed long anymore. Automation, loneliness, and storms tended to burn people out. The ferry that took me there was just a small supply boat that ran once a week. The captain, a gray-bearded man named Richard, didn't say much except, "You'll hear things out there sometimes. Don't go looking." I thought he meant foghorns or waves or maybe my own thoughts playing tricks. The living quarters were small, a narrow bed, a desk with a radio, a kitchenette, and a spiral staircase that climbed up to the beacon room. The walls were cold even in daytime. There was a faint smell of rust and damp rope. The first few nights were uneventful. The sea hissed constantly below, and the light rotated smoothly with a soft mechanical hum. I'd spend the hours reading or writing in the logbook, noting down wind speeds and temperatures. Around 2 a.m., I'd climb the stairs to check the lens and wipe off condensation. The light itself was beautiful, an enormous Fresnel lens that threw a white beam across the black water. The fifth night, the fog rolled in so thick that it swallowed the sound of the waves. I could barely see the catwalk railing when I stepped outside. It was absolute stillness. No birds, no wind, not even the creak of the metal tower. Then I heard the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps echoing from below. I froze. It wasn't the sound of waves slapping the foundation or a loose chain. It was knuckles on metal, steady, human. I leaned over the railing, peering down the side of the tower, but the fog was like concrete. I couldn't even see the rocks at the base. "Hello," I called. My voice came out small. The knock didn't come again, but I felt something, like someone had looked up at me from below. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Next morning, I mentioned it over the radio when the Coast Guard did their check-in. The operator just laughed. "You're hearing the sea, rookie. Happens to everybody." Maybe he was right. Isolation can warp things. But that night, around the same hour, I heard the knock again. 3 times. And then, faintly, something dragging along the metal stairs that wound up through the tower. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it down the central spiral. The light didn't reach far. The stairs seemed to sink into the dark below like a well. "Who's there?" I said, louder this time. My voice bounced off the walls. No answer. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening to the slow, rhythmic creak of the tower shifting. Then I went back to my chair, trying to ignore the sensation that I wasn't alone. By morning, there were wet footprints on the first 2 steps of the staircase. Human-sized, bare feet leading up from the heavy steel door that opened out to the platform. The door was still bolted from the inside. I took a photo with my phone before the sun dried them up. The Coast Guard again told me to relax. Humidity, condensation, pareidolia. Your brain makes patterns when you're bored, the man on the radio said. But I knew what I saw. A few nights later, the fog returned, thicker than before. The knock came again, but this time from the middle level where the generator room was. It was followed by a low, scraping moan, like someone dragging a wet sack across the floor. The power flickered. The light on top of the tower stuttered, went dark for 5 seconds, then came back. That was the first recorded outage since 2008, I later learned. I had written it all down in the log, my handwriting trembling. When dawn came, I checked the generator room. Everything looked fine, except for a patch of seawater pooled under the hatch door that led to the lower maintenance tunnel. That tunnel went straight down to the foundation, where the cables entered through the rock. It was supposed to stay locked, but the latch was hanging loose. I went down with my flashlight, careful on the slick iron ladder. The tunnel smelled like salt and rot. At the bottom, the walls were sweating. I ran the light across the floor and froze. There were handprints pressed into the grime on the metal, smears that trailed toward the corner where the drainage grate was. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The grate itself rattled suddenly, making me jump. Something below it, something heavy, shifted and sloshed in the water beneath the floor. I scrambled back up that ladder so fast I cut my palm on a bolt. I stayed awake all day after that, sitting near the door with my radio and flashlight. I didn't go near the tunnel again. That night, around midnight, the radio hissed. Not the Coast Guard. This was static. Then a faint voice came through, garbled and warped. "Light out! Can't see." I answered, "This is Station 41. Who is this?" Nothing but static. Then, slowly, I heard something else through the speaker, the sound of waves crashing and a man sobbing softly as if right next to the mic. Then the voice said my name. "Mark." I dropped the radio. Nobody knew me out there except the Coast Guard office and the ferry captain. Neither would pull something like that. I checked the light again. It was still working, sweeping over the fog. I went to the logbook, flipped through the older entries. There were notes from the previous keeper, a guy named Howard, from early 2015. His last entry said, "He's under the stairs again. The light doesn't keep him away anymore." I slammed the book shut. Over the next week, things escalated. The knocking became nightly, moving up and down the tower. Once I heard it from inside the walls, metal expanding or something crawling. I started hearing whispers from the ventilation shaft, just barely intelligible words like stay and below. I stopped sleeping properly. My dreams were filled with water seeping through the floor, rising up my legs as something pulled me down into the black. Then came the storm. The forecast had called for rough seas, but this one was biblical. The tower shook under the force of the waves, wind screaming against the glass. Around 1 a.m., the light started to flicker again. I ran up to the beacon room, trying to keep my balance on the swaying stairs. The motor was straining, gears whining. Through the storm, the fog seemed alive, twisting in shapes that looked like people. And then I saw him. A figure on the outer walkway, drenched, barefoot, his clothes hanging in tatters. His eyes glowed faintly in the sweeping beam. He was staring straight at me through the glass. I yelled, "Who are you?" and grabbed for the door latch to pull him in, but the door was locked from my side. The wind howled louder, and when the light passed over again, he was gone. But the footprints appeared, wet, trailing from the door to the stairs. I followed them down halfway before the power cut out entirely. The beacon went dark. The generator room hummed for a moment and died. I was left in complete blackness except for my flashlight. From below, I heard the scraping again, something metallic being dragged across the floor. Then a low, wet, gurgling sound, like a drowning man trying to breathe. I aimed the light down the stairwell, shaking. The beam caught movement, something shifting just around the curve of the lower level. I shouted that I was armed, though I wasn't. Then the light went out. It wasn't the battery. It was like something had swallowed the light whole. I backed up until my shoulders hit the wall, heart hammering. For the next few minutes or hours, I don't know, I heard footsteps slowly climbing the stairs, bare feet, each one slick and soft, squelching on the metal steps. When they reached my level, everything went silent again. Then I felt a hand brush my sleeve. Ice cold. I screamed and stumbled upward in the dark, slamming into walls, scraping my knees and palms. I didn't stop until I reached the beacon room again. I slammed the hatch shut behind me and held it closed. The storm outside raged for the rest of the night. I stayed up there until dawn, watching the gray light seep through the fog. When I finally dared open the hatch, there were wet handprints all over the inside of it. When the ferry came that afternoon with supplies, I begged them to take me back. Richard just looked at me and said quietly, "You saw him, didn't you?" I nodded. He sighed. "You weren't the first, won't be the last." He told me that back in 1949, a keeper named Alan had gone missing during a hurricane. They never found the body, just his boots near the rocks below the tower. The Coast Guard replaced him, and since then, strange things had happened. Lights flickering, radios picking up ghost transmissions, doors opening by themselves. Alan kept the light running through that whole storm. Richard said, maybe he still thinks he has to. I left the lighthouse that day and never went back. But 2 months later, the Coast Guard called me. They said the automatic system had malfunctioned again, and when the next keeper arrived, he found wet footprints on the stairs, leading all the way up to the beacon. I still have the logbook. Sometimes I read the last line I wrote before leaving. He's still out there, keeping the light. Even now, when I drive near the coast at night, I can see that faint beam cutting across the water. And every so often, just as the light swings past, I swear there's a shadow standing in the glass room at the top, watching. Story the end. I started working the night shift at the Wren Point Lighthouse in late October of 2012. The job came through a friend of my uncle's who worked with the Coast Guard and told me they were having trouble keeping anyone on through the winter. Most of the guys who'd signed up for the off-season shifts quit within a month, claiming the isolation and the weather were too much. I was 26, single, and pretty desperate for steady work, so I didn't think twice about it. The pay was decent, and they provided housing, an old keeper's cottage about 50 yards from the lighthouse itself. Wren Point was located off the coast of Maine near a small fishing village called Caldersport. The nearest store was a good 30-minute drive inland, and the lighthouse was on a jut of rock that extended into the Atlantic, surrounded by crashing surf on 3 sides. The road leading there was narrow and lined with trees that looked half dead by November. When I first arrived, I was struck by how remote it felt. Even the air seemed heavier. The cottage was old but functional. 2 rooms, a kitchen with a gas stove, and a small bathroom that looked like it hadn't been remodeled since the 1960s. My first night on the job, I was trained by the daytime keeper, an older man named Hank, who'd worked there for over 30 years. Hank was the kind of guy who didn't talk much unless you asked direct questions, and even then, he'd mostly grunt or nod. He showed me how to operate the light, log ship traffic, and do the radio check-ins with the Coast Guard every few hours. Everything was pretty straightforward. My main job was to keep the light running and report any malfunctions. The only thing Hank said that struck me as odd was during our last few minutes together, before he handed over the shift. We were standing inside the lighthouse at the top level where the massive Fresnel lens rotated with a steady hum. He looked at me with this flat, serious expression and said, "You hear anything at night, don't go outside, and don't shut the light off for any reason. Even if it stops spinning for a second, keep it running. You understand?" I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his face didn't change. "Yeah, sure," I said, and he just nodded and went down the stairs without another word. That first night was uneventful. I brewed some coffee, brought a book, and sat by the window listening to the waves. Around 2 in the morning, I went outside for a smoke. The wind was cutting and cold, but the view was incredible. Nothing but black ocean and white spray where the light hit the waves. I could hear the rhythmic sweep of the light's machinery and the gulls screaming somewhere out over the water. I felt completely alone but not uncomfortable. Over the next week, the isolation started to sink in. The days were short, and by 4 in the afternoon, the sun had already started to drop. Nights stretched forever. The only sound was the sea, the wind, and occasionally the old wood of the cottage groaning in the cold. I started to notice how different the world felt after midnight, like the ocean came closer, louder, more alive somehow. The first strange thing happened on my 5th night. Around 1 in the morning, I was doing a walk around, checking the locks and making sure the fuel backup was stable. The fog had rolled in thick, so dense I couldn't even see the end of the catwalk. As I made my way back toward the lighthouse, I heard what sounded like someone talking. It wasn't a shout or a scream, just this low, steady murmur that carried through the fog. I froze, listening. The voice was faint, but definitely human. I thought maybe someone from the Coast Guard had come by unexpectedly. I took my flashlight and tried to peer into the fog, calling out, "Hello? Hello? You all right out there?" No answer. The voice stopped immediately when I spoke. I waited for another minute, then went back inside. I radioed the Coast Guard just in case, but no one else was in the area. They told me it was probably the sound of the surf echoing in the fog. I accepted that explanation, but the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing just outside the fog line, watching. A few nights later, it happened again. Same time, around 1 a.m., and same low murmuring voice. This time it sounded closer, like right outside the lighthouse door. I walked over to the small round window near the base of the stairs and tried to look out, but all I saw was my reflection and a wall of white fog. I opened the door just a crack, and the sound stopped again. The cold air that rushed in made me gasp. There was a faint smell, too, like salt water and something else, something sour, almost metallic. I shut the door quickly. After that night, I started noticing other small things. Tools would move from where I'd left them. The spare bulbs for the light would be taken out of their cases and set on the workbench, unscrewed, even though I hadn't used them. The first time it happened, I thought I was just being forgetful. But the third time, I started locking the supply cabinet. That didn't stop it. One morning, after finishing my shift, I went to bed in the cottage around 6. I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my front door. It was bright daylight, probably around 10 a.m. I thought maybe it was Hank or someone from the village, so I got up and answered. There was no one there. But what I did see were wet footprints, bare feet, leading away from the porch, down toward the rocks near the water. I followed them for maybe 30 feet before they disappeared. I called Hank later that day and asked him about it, trying to sound casual. He didn't say much at first, just listened quietly. When I finished, he said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes. Don't follow them again. You don't want to go where they lead." That was all he said before hanging up. By mid-November, the weather had turned brutal. The wind howled around the lighthouse like a living thing, rattling the glass. The generator sputtered some nights, and I'd have to go outside to restart it. Each time I dreaded stepping into that fog. It always felt thicker than it should be, pressing in on me from every side. Once, while restarting the generator, I thought I saw someone standing near the edge of the rocks. Just a shape, tall, thin, motionless. I aimed my flashlight at it, but it vanished. I didn't sleep well after that. The nights started blending together. I'd hear whispers through the radio, static-filled broken voices that didn't belong to the Coast Guard. Sometimes it sounded like they were saying my name, but when I called for confirmation, there was only silence. One particularly rough night in early December, a storm rolled in off the ocean. The wind was so strong, the lighthouse actually shook. The waves crashed high enough to spray the windows. I stayed inside, keeping an eye on the machinery. Around midnight, the power flickered, and for just a few seconds, the beacon went out. In that moment, I heard something I'll never forget. From the outside, somewhere near the base of the lighthouse, came this horrible, drawn-out wail. It sounded like a person drowning, gasping and choking between screams. I grabbed the radio and tried calling it in, but all I heard was static. The wailing went on for almost a full minute, rising and falling like the wind was carrying it closer, then farther away. When the power came back on and the light resumed spinning, the sound stopped instantly. I didn't go outside again that night. The next morning, I found the footprints again, bare, wet, leading right up to the lighthouse door and stopping there. They were smaller this time, like from a child. A few days later, the fog came back thick as ever, and I could barely see my own hands. I'd gotten used to hearing faint whispers at this point, but that night they were louder. More voices, men, women, even a child, murmuring all around the lighthouse. It sounded like they were just beyond the wall of fog. I stood frozen by the door, my flashlight in hand, listening. Then I heard a soft knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I backed away. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I called out again. "Who's there?" But no one answered. The knocks came again, louder this time. I ran up the stairs to the observation deck and looked out. Nothing but swirling fog and the faint red blink of the buoy light far out in the water. I stayed awake the rest of that shift, sitting in the control room with the radio crackling beside me. Around 3 a.m., the radio picked up a faint signal, someone repeating my name over and over in a whispering voice. Eli, that's my name. It wasn't Hank. It wasn't the Coast Guard. I turned the dial, but the voice followed through the static. It got louder until I shut the radio off completely. The silence that followed was worse. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the metal door to the lighthouse. Not just a few. They were long, uneven gouges, like something had clawed at it. The paint was peeled back, and there were tiny rust-colored stains on the handle. I didn't want to think about what it was. I drove into Caldersport that day to buy extra locks and supplies. When I mentioned some of what I'd been hearing to a local guy at the hardware store, he gave me a strange look. Then he said, "You're at Wren Point, right?" I nodded. He leaned in a little and said, "You know about the wreck, don't you?" I didn't. He told me that back in the early 1900s, a ship called the Miriam B went down right off the point during a fog storm. The lighthouse light had gone out that night, some kind of malfunction, and the ship struck the rocks. Everyone on board drowned. Locals said their bodies washed up for days after, but a few were never found, including the captain's young daughter. When I got back to the lighthouse that night, I couldn't stop thinking about that story. I kept picturing the bodies in the water, the fog swallowing them whole. The whispers that had been haunting me started to make sense in a sick way, like they were trying to tell me something. That night, the whispers turned into full voices. I could hear them clearly now, calling names, crying, begging for help. I couldn't tell if they were coming from outside or inside the walls. The air grew cold enough that my breath hung like smoke, even inside the lighthouse. Around 2 a.m., I saw something move at the base of the spiral staircase. I pointed my flashlight, and there, standing in the beam, was a figure. A woman, soaked, her hair hanging in strings over her face. Her clothes clung to her body, dripping onto the metal floor. I froze, unable to breathe. She looked up at me slowly, and even though her eyes were hidden by her hair, I could feel her stare. Then she was gone. Just gone. The next few minutes were a blur. I ran up the stairs, locked myself in the control room, and stayed there until morning. When the sun came up, everything looked normal again. No water on the floor, no footprints, but the smell of salt and rot lingered. I called Hank again that morning. I told him everything. Every sound, every voice, the woman. There was a long silence on the line before he finally said, "They warned us not to stay after midnight when the fog's in. That's when the ones who drowned come looking for the light." His voice trembled. "Don't let it go out again, Eli. Whatever you do, don't let it go out." That night, I double-checked every part of the generator. The wind was vicious, and the fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen. Around midnight, the whispers started again, soft all around me. I ignored them and kept the light steady. But then, around 1, the light flickered once, just once, and everything went quiet. For a full minute, the world was silent. No waves, no wind, nothing. Then came a sound like water rushing through the door. I ran down the stairs, and to my horror, the floor was wet. Seawater was pouring in through the cracks around the door, rising fast. I grabbed the emergency radio, but it sputtered uselessly. Then I saw them, figures in the fog outside the window. Dozens of them, faces pale, eyes hollow. They pressed against the glass, mouths moving in silent screams. One by one, they disappeared into the mist until only one remained. A small figure, standing still, a child. She raised her hand and pressed it against the glass. The water kept rising, up to my knees now. I rushed to seal the cracks, but the pressure grew worse. I could hear the beams groaning. Then I heard her voice, faint and clear. "Help us. Turn the light on." I looked up, and the beacon had stopped spinning. I ran up the stairs, slipping on the wet metal, and hit the manual switch. The light sputtered, then caught, the beam slicing through the fog. Immediately, the sound of rushing water stopped. When I looked down, the floor was dry again. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but when I woke up, the morning sun was streaming through the windows. Everything looked normal again. But outside the door, in the dried salt line left by the vanished water, were small footprints leading away toward the shore. I quit 2 days later. Hank didn't seem surprised when I told him. He just said quietly, "You lasted longer than most." I still dream about that place sometimes. I dream of the fog rolling in, the light flickering, and the sound of someone knocking at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I can still hear the ocean crashing somewhere close. I've never gone back to Wren Point, but sometimes, when I drive the coast late at night, I see the faint beam of the lighthouse sweeping through the dark, steady, and cold. And I wonder if anyone's inside, keeping watch, or if it's just the ones still waiting for the light to guide them home. Story the end. It was early October when I first took the night shift at the Lighthouse on Devil's Point. The Coast Guard had been understaffed, and the small town nearby needed someone reliable to keep the light burning for the freighters that passed through the jagged cliffs. I wasn't a stranger to isolation. I'd worked maintenance on offshore platforms, but the lighthouse promised something different. A standing tower, the roar of waves below, and the kind of silence that could press against your chest like a heavy blanket. The first week was mostly routine. I'd arrive around 7 in the evening, walk the spiral staircase to the top, and perform the inspection. Everything was as it should be. Lenses polished, oil reservoirs full, and the machinery whirring smoothly. I'd fill out the logbook, noting the time each rotation of the light took, then settle into the keeper's quarters with a thermos of coffee and a stack of paperbacks. The ocean stretched dark and endless beyond the windows, with only the faint glimmer of distant ship lights. By the third night, though, the isolation started to wear on me. The lighthouse was old, built in the late 1800s, and it had that particular kind of quiet that isn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Sometimes I thought I could hear footsteps on the spiral staircase behind me, though I was alone. The wind screamed against the stone walls, but these footsteps were lighter, deliberate, almost soft enough to be human. I chalked it up to fatigue. One night around 2 in the morning, I was checking the lens rotation when I noticed something strange. The beam of the lighthouse, which normally cut in a sharp circle across the water, seemed to flicker just for a second over a small, rocky outcrop about 100 yards away from the base. At first, I thought it was a trick of the reflection, but then I swore I saw a figure standing there, motionless, watching me. I froze. The figure had to have been a trick of the shadows, right? I told myself that over and over. But later that night, when I went down to inspect the lower lantern room, I found footprints in the dust leading away from the rocks toward the lighthouse door. They weren't mine, and they weren't wet like they came from the tide. They were something else. Long, narrow, and spaced unevenly, as if whoever or whatever was walking there didn't quite have a normal gait. I stayed awake the rest of that night, listening to the ocean and watching the shadows. At sunrise, the figure was gone, the footprints vanished, and everything was as normal as a lighthouse could be. But the memory stayed, gnawing at me like a whisper in the back of my head. The following week, things escalated. I began to notice sounds in the middle of the night. A low scraping sound coming from the storage room, the faint smell of salt and decay drifting up the spiral staircase, even though I had sealed the doors. The radio, which I kept tuned for weather alerts, sometimes emitted static in patterns that sounded almost like someone trying to speak. Once, I thought I heard my name. I tried to rationalize everything. Wind, old wood settling, my imagination. But there were moments when rationalization didn't hold. One night, I woke to the sound of laughter echoing up the staircase. High-pitched, brittle, like glass cracking. My flashlight flickered, and I could swear I saw a shadow moving at the top of the stairs, just for a second, then vanish. I called out, thinking maybe a trespasser had somehow made it in, but there was no response. On the fifth night, I decided to lock myself in the keeper's quarters and watch from the small observation window. The ocean was black and empty, except for the lighthouse beam slicing through it. Around midnight, I noticed a rowboat appear far off the shore, moving against the current. It seemed tiny, almost like a toy, but I could see someone in it. A figure hunched over, rowing. No lights, no sound, just the dark shape cutting through the waves. I grabbed my binoculars and focused, and that's when I realized the figure had no face. Not in the literal sense, but it was featureless, smooth where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. My stomach turned cold. I turned to radio for backup, but the channel was dead. Not even static. Just silence. I thought about leaving immediately, calling for help, but I had to finish my shift. The thought of abandoning the lighthouse, leaving it unlit for ships in the dark, made my blood run colder than the ocean spray. So I stayed. The figure rowed closer. From the observation window, I could see it more clearly now. Its hands long, unnaturally thin, gripping the oars. The water around the boat didn't ripple normally. It shimmered as if the figure moved through a thin layer of darkness. And then it stopped. Just froze mid-row, staring directly at the lighthouse. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to go down to the dock. Part of me wanted to confront it, or at least confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the spiral staircase. Step by step, the echo of my own footsteps loud in the empty tower. By the time I reached the bottom, the rowboat was gone. No wake, no tracks, nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, coffee in hand, trying to convince myself that whatever I was experiencing had a rational explanation. The wind howled, the ocean roared, and somewhere in the distance, the foghorn bellowed. And then, just before dawn, I saw it again. Standing at the edge of the cliff, just beyond the rocks, the same faceless figure. This time, it wasn't in a boat. It was walking toward the lighthouse. I ran back up to the spiral staircase, locked every door I could, and tried to radio again. Still dead. By the time the sun began to rise, the figure had retreated, dissolving into the morning fog like it had never been there. I tried to tell the townspeople about it during the day. They were polite but dismissive. The lighthouse plays tricks on the mind, the local historian said. Fog, wind, isolation, you'll get used to it. I wanted to believe that. I wanted it more than anything. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Weeks went by. Some nights were uneventful, but the figure returned. Always at night, always silent, always watching. Sometimes I'd hear scratching at the windows, just like fingernails tracing the glass. Sometimes I'd find objects moved, a wrench out of place, a logbook on the floor, pages torn out. Nothing valuable, just enough to make me question my own sanity. One night, during a particularly violent storm, the lighthouse shook violently. The light flickered, and I heard a sound I had never heard before: the creak of wood under pressure, followed by a low, guttural moan. The moan wasn't human. It rolled through the tower, echoing off the walls, filling every corner of the building. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the top to check the lens. Everything was intact, nothing had fallen. But then I saw it. A figure, taller than any human, its body blurred and shimmering like the heat haze over asphalt, stood at the edge of the lantern room. Its face was faceless, but it tilted its head toward me. The beam of the lighthouse illuminated it in shards of white light. My knees buckled. I fell back, sliding down the stairs, heart pounding, lungs burning. When I reached the bottom, the figure was gone, and in its place was a wet, smudged handprint on the outer wall of the tower. Not human-sized. Longer. Wider. I pressed my palms to it. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and the stone beneath it seemed to pulse as if the hand had left a mark, not just physically, but spiritually. I couldn't stay. I knew it. That night, I called the Coast Guard, explained the situation, and requested immediate transfer. They sent a team the next morning. When they arrived, the lighthouse seemed normal again. No footprints, no scratches, no signs of the faceless figure, just the old, creaking tower, standing silently against the wind and waves. I didn't return to the lighthouse after that. I moved inland, got a desk job, and tried to forget. But every now and then, late at night, when the wind rattles the window panes, I remember the sound of the staircase creaking behind me, the glint of something faceless in the darkness, and the knowledge that the lighthouse still stands there, waiting, watching, and maybe even remembering me. Years later, I heard that a few keepers after me reported similar experiences. Some quit mid-shift, refusing to return. Some logged strange readings on the instruments: magnetic anomalies, sudden temperature drops, inexplicable static on the radio. No one talked openly about the faceless figure, but the stories lined up. The lighthouse didn't just isolate you, it tested you, watched you, and sometimes it let something else in. Something that wasn't human, and certainly wasn't alive. I still have nightmares. They're never the ocean, never the storms. They're the staircase, the beam, the feeling of eyes on my back. Sometimes I dream of the faceless figure rowing silently in the dark waters, stopping, turning toward me with that impossible blank stare, and knowing in the deepest part of my mind that it isn't waiting for me to leave, it's waiting for me to notice. I can't tell you why it chooses to appear or why some people see it while others don't. I only know that it's real, and that the night shift at Devil's Point Lighthouse is not just lonely, it's dangerous. Isolation, darkness, and that endless ocean can warp your mind. But the figure is something else entirely. It doesn't care about sanity. It doesn't care about light. It only waits. And sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I can feel it. Standing just beyond the shadows, counting the rotations of a light it cannot extinguish, but one it will always haunt. I've never returned to the lighthouse, but I know one day someone else will take that night shift. Someone else will climb the spiral staircase, check the lenses, and look out across the black water. And when they do, the figure will be there. Watching. Waiting. Faceless. Patient. Story the end. It was November of 1996 when I first started working the night shift at the old Harrows Point Lighthouse, a solitary tower that stood on a craggy stretch of the Maine coastline. The Atlantic was rough there. Waves constantly crashing into the rocks, salt spray carried by the wind, and gulls screeching day and night. The lighthouse had been operational since the late 1800s and was now automated, but the Coast Guard still assigned a keeper to monitor the systems, perform maintenance, and keep logs. My job was to make sure the light never went out, no matter what happened. It wasn't my first night shift job, but it was the loneliest by far. The nearest town, Port Waverly, was about 15 miles inland. The only road to the lighthouse was a narrow, cracked path through dense pine forest, and once you reached the end, the world opened up to an empty cliff with the sea roaring below. The tower itself was attached to a small cottage where I stayed during my week-long rotations. There was no television, no radio reception except for the emergency frequency, and the generator hummed constantly in the background, like a living thing. I'd taken the job because I needed distance. My marriage had fallen apart that summer, and after the divorce, I wanted to be as far away from people as possible. A friend from the Coast Guard had mentioned the lighthouse posting. It paid well, included housing, and required almost no human contact. I thought it sounded perfect. My first couple of nights passed without incident. The routine was simple: check the beacon at dusk, ensure the foghorn and backup systems were functional, make rounds every few hours, and log everything in the maintenance book. The wind never stopped, and sometimes it howled through the cracks in the tower so loudly that it felt like the building was moaning. Still, there was a strange peace to it. I spent my breaks reading by lantern light, drinking coffee, and listening to the rhythm of the sea. On my fourth night, the peace started to break. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting at the desk writing in the logbook when I heard what sounded like a knock coming from the storage room at the back of the cottage. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a loose shutter, but then it came again, 3 distinct knocks, slow and deliberate. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked down the short hall toward the sound. The door to the storage room was closed. I pulled it open, half expecting a raccoon or bird had gotten in through a vent, but there was nothing. The air was cold, heavier than it should have been. When I turned the flashlight toward the corner, I noticed the old trapdoor in the floor, the one that led to the basement. I hadn't opened it since I arrived. I knew it existed because the manual mentioned it, saying it housed older wiring and pump systems that were no longer in use. The sound, though, seemed to have come from right above that door. I stood there listening, but all I heard was the faint creaking of the lighthouse tower swaying slightly in the wind. I told myself it was probably just the pressure difference, maybe a draft, and went back to my desk. The next night, around the same hour, I was doing my second inspection round in the tower. The wind had picked up, and the fog was so thick I couldn't see more than 10 feet past the glass of the lantern room. I was checking the rotation of the lens when I thought I heard something outside. A voice carried on the wind. It was faint, almost like someone calling for help, a drawn-out he-elp that barely rose above the roar of the waves. I froze. It came again, slightly louder this time. I ran down the spiral stairs 2 steps at a time and threw open the door that led out to the catwalk. The air hit me like ice. I scanned the rocks below with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the fog in thin streaks, but there was no one there. The sea was violent, crashing so hard it sent spray 50 feet up. No one could have been out there, not in that weather. I waited, listening, but the voice didn't come again. Back inside, I wrote it off as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the second week, the strange occurrences were becoming routine. Footsteps on the stairs when I was certain I was alone, the generator sputtering even though it had been freshly serviced, the logbook flipping open by itself when the windows were closed. Every time I tried to rationalize it, something new would happen to unsettle me all over again. On November 15th, a storm rolled in, a real nor'easter. The wind howled so fiercely it rattled the window frames, and the sea turned into a white, churning nightmare. I checked the beacon constantly to make sure it stayed lit. If the light went out, ships could crash into the rocks. The foghorn moaned every 30 seconds, its low tone shaking the walls. Around 11 p.m., I lost power. The generator went dead, plunging the entire station into darkness. I grabbed the emergency lantern and went out to the shed to check the generator. Rain hammered my hood and water soaked my boots instantly. The shed door was banging in the wind when I reached it. Inside, the air smelled of oil and sea spray. The switch had tripped, so I reset it and waited for the hum to return. Instead, I heard something moving behind the shed. It wasn't the wind. It was slower, deliberate, footsteps crunching on gravel. I turned the lantern toward the sound, but the light barely reached beyond the corner. "Hello?" I shouted, the wind nearly stealing my voice. No response, just the rhythmic pounding of waves and the occasional hiss of rain on metal. I stepped around the shed. The beam of my lantern caught something in the distance, what looked like a man standing near the cliff's edge. He was tall, wearing what I thought was a long coat, maybe a rain slicker. His back was to me, head slightly tilted up toward the light tower. For a moment, I thought maybe it was one of the Coast Guard inspectors, but nobody could have come out in that storm. "Hey!" I yelled, moving closer. The figure didn't move. My boots slipped on the wet rock as I got within 20 feet of him. "You need to get inside," I shouted again. He turned his head slowly toward me, and I swear, even through the sheets of rain, I saw his face, or what was left of it. It was pale, the skin sagging like it had been underwater too long. His eyes looked cloudy, almost white, and his mouth hung open slightly as if he was trying to say something but couldn't. I stumbled back, losing my footing for a second, and when I looked up again, he was gone. I ran back to the cottage, heart pounding. The generator kicked back on as I slammed the door shut, light flooding the room again. I locked the door and stood there dripping, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I thought I had. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, when the storm had passed, I went out to inspect the grounds. The rocks near the cliff were slick, and the grass was matted down from the rain. Where I'd seen the man standing, there were fresh footprints, bare ones, with toes clearly visible in the mud. They led straight toward the edge of the cliff and stopped there. Nothing else. When I radioed the Coast Guard to report the generator failure, I didn't mention the figure. I just said I'd gone out to fix it and everything was operational again. The man on the other end said a storm like that often caused strange echoes and mirages on the coast, that I probably saw my own reflection or light distortion. But those footprints were real. I saw them myself. Over the next few days, I became more cautious. I checked the doors twice before nightfall and started keeping the old service revolver from the supply locker close to my desk. The nights stretched endlessly, and I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming half the time. Sometimes I'd wake up to the sound of someone walking around upstairs in the lantern room, boots clanging on metal. When I went up to check, it was empty every time. One night, I decided to record what I was hearing. I had an old cassette recorder I used for notes, and I left it running while I did my rounds. When I played it back later, there were sounds that made my skin crawl. You could hear the wind, yes, but underneath that, faintly, there were whispers. Low, indecipherable voices that seemed to be repeating something. I couldn't make out words, but it wasn't just noise. It was speech. That was when I started digging through the old station logs. The Coast Guard had kept them stored in a wooden cabinet in the office. Most were boring, entries about maintenance, fog conditions, and light checks. But then I found a journal dated from 1958. The handwriting was jagged and uneven. The keeper back then was a man named Walter Briggs. His entries started off normal, but around December of that year, the tone changed. He wrote about hearing footsteps in the tower, seeing shadows move in the lantern room when no one was there. The last entry chilled me to the bone. He's back again. The man from the water says he wants his light returned. That was the final entry. There were no reports after that, just a notation in the Coast Guard archive that Briggs disappeared during a severe storm. The man from the water. That phrase repeated in my head for days. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, that maybe Briggs had gone mad from isolation. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The next storm came less than a week later. This one was worse, thunder shaking the foundation, waves crashing so high they reached the lower windows. Around midnight, the power flickered again. I rushed to the control panel to stabilize the current, and I heard something heavy hit the door, like a body slamming against it. I froze, staring at the knob as it rattled violently. Someone or something was trying to get in. I shouted, "Who's there?" but the wind swallowed my voice. The banging stopped suddenly. Then came a scraping sound along the door, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. I backed away slowly, gripping the revolver with shaking hands. After a minute of silence, I gathered enough courage to pull the curtain aside and look through the small window next to the door. The light outside flickered, and through the rain-streaked glass, I saw a face pressed against it. Pale. Sunken. The same face I'd seen near the cliff. His mouth moved like he was whispering, but I couldn't hear through the storm. I dropped the curtain and stumbled back. When I finally looked again, the window was empty. I didn't open that door until sunrise. When the storm cleared, I found water tracks across the floor near the entrance, like wet footprints. They led halfway across the room and then just stopped, fading into nothing. I didn't report it. I knew no one would believe me. 2 nights later, I was sitting at my desk, when the light at the top of the tower suddenly went out. No power outage, no warning, just darkness. The foghorn still worked, so I knew the main systems were fine. I grabbed the lantern and climbed the stairs. As I ascended, the air grew colder with each step. I could hear the faint hum of the backup light trying to start but failing. When I reached the lantern room, I saw condensation on the inside of the glass, like breath. My reflection in the window seemed off, distorted. I turned to wipe the glass, and when I looked back, there was a figure standing behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but the room was empty. Then, from somewhere above, I heard the sound of dripping water. It was strange because there was no place for water to drip from. The roof was sealed tight. I followed the sound to the far corner near the spiral stairs. There, on the metal grate, was a single puddle of seawater. Floating in it was a rusted piece of brass, the nameplate from an old uniform. I picked it up, wiped it clean, and saw the name W. Briggs. That was the night I decided to leave. I packed my bag before dawn and waited until the relief keeper arrived by boat the next morning. I didn't tell him much, just that I wasn't feeling well and needed to cut my rotation short. He looked at me like he could tell something was wrong, but he didn't press. As the boat pulled away from Harrow's Point, I looked back at the tower. For a moment, just before we rounded the bend, I thought I saw someone standing at the top in the lantern room. A tall figure, motionless, watching the sea. I never went back. The Coast Guard kept the lighthouse manned for another few years before fully automating it. In 2002, a technician doing routine checks found the basement trapdoor open. Inside, they discovered old, corroded maintenance tools and a sealed hatch that led directly to a sea tunnel carved into the rock. It had been used during the 1800s for bringing supplies in from boats when the weather was too rough for docking. The tunnel was half flooded and dangerous, but one detail stood out. They found skeletal remains near the end of the tunnel, still wearing a tattered uniform with a faded name tag, W. Briggs. When I heard that, I didn't sleep for days. The man from the water had been real. Sometimes, when I drive up the Maine coast and see the distant sweep of a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog, I think about Harrow's Point. I wonder if the light ever goes out anymore. I wonder if Briggs ever found peace. But most nights, I try not to think about it at all, because every now and then when the wind picks up outside my house and the ocean air drifts inland, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of a foghorn, and underneath it, a voice whispering through the dark calling for his light to be returned. Story the end.